The pop of a champagne cork echoed through the sleek glass lobby of Novatech, bouncing off the imported marble floors and soaring ceilings. I stood frozen near the bank of elevators, clutching a bouquet of rare black roses and two first-class tickets to Paris in my hands. I had come to surprise my husband for Valentine's Day. I had spent weeks planning the perfect getaway, a chance for us to reconnect away from his demanding job. Instead, the surprise was entirely mine. Marcus was on one knee in the center of the expansive room, surrounded by dozens of cheering employees. He was smiling that charming, arrogant smile of his, looking up at a woman who was definitely not me. He was sliding a massive 5-carat diamond ring onto the finger of his boss, Victoria, the CEO of the company. I watched in stunned silence as he stood up and kissed her, holding her hand high into the air for the crowd to see. The employees erupted into thunderous applause, raising their champagne flutes to toast the happy couple. I did not scream. I did not drop the roses. I did not shed a single tear. I simply turned on my heel and walked right back out the sliding glass doors into the cold afternoon air. Within 10 minutes, I sat in the driver's seat of my practical sedan and went to work. I canceled the Paris flights with a few taps on my screen. I logged into my banking app and instantly froze every joint account we shared, cutting off his access to thousands of dollars. Then I made one final crucial phone call. My name is Maya, and I am 32 years old. For 7 years, I let my husband and his family believe I was just a simple woman, struggling to run a small homemade soap and candle business out of our garage. They had absolutely no idea that I was the silent, anonymous founder of Apex Holdings, the venture capital behemoth that funded their entire world. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to teach a harsh, permanent lesson to those who mistook your silence for weakness. My phone buzzed relentlessly in the cup holder as the rain began to fall against my windshield. The screen lit up showing 132 missed calls from Marcus. The news of my financial maneuvers must have already reached the executive floor. I ignored his frantic attempts to reach me and dialed my wealth manager. The line connected immediately. Trigger the withdrawal clause on Novatech. I instructed my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. Pull my entire 86% ownership stake. Liquidate the assets, freeze their credit lines, and initiate a full corporate audit. I want the withdrawal executed before the markets close today. My wealth manager did not hesitate or ask questions. He simply confirmed the order. I ended the call and tossed my phone onto the passenger seat right next to the now useless Paris tickets. I had just pulled $678 million out from under Victoria and Marcus. For years, I had endured the subtle and blatant disrespect from Marcus and his toxic family. I remembered sitting at his mother Evelyn's dining room table just last Thanksgiving while she loudly praised Marcus for his promotion to marketing director. In the same breath, she had looked at my simple dress with pure disdain and asked when I was going to get a real job with corporate benefits instead of making bath bombs in the dark. Marcus had just laughed, sipping his expensive wine and agreeing that my little hobby was cute but completely unprofitable. I let them enjoy their false sense of superiority. I let his sister Kiara make snide comments about my natural hair and my lack of designer handbags. I let her white husband Chad, a mid-level Wall Street broker, lecture me about macroeconomics and generational wealth, as if I did not own the very skyscraper his firm leased their office space from. I kept my head down, poured my energy into Apex Holdings, and built an empire they could not even fathom. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the parking garage, leaving behind the cheering crowds, the champagne, and the monumental lie that had been my marriage. The drive back to our upscale suburban house was a blur of gray skies and steady rain. When I pulled into the driveway of the property Marcus proudly claimed he paid for, though my blind trust actually held the deed, the neighborhood was eerily quiet. I walked inside, shedding my wet coat and placing my keys on the entry table. The silence of the house felt entirely different now. It was no longer a shared sanctuary. It was a crime scene of broken vows and misplaced arrogance. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of cold water, letting the reality of the afternoon truly settle over me. They thought they held all the power. They thought I was a naive, easily discarded woman who would quietly disappear. My phone finally stopped buzzing. A heavy, suffocating silence hung in the air for a fraction of a second. Then a dark shadow fell across the frosted glass of the front door. The doorbell rang. It was not a polite chime but a rapid, aggressive pounding that echoed violently through the entire house. Marcus had arrived. And based on the multiple shadows shifting angrily against the glass, he had not come alone. The heavy thud of fists against the solid mahogany door signaled that the real war was about to begin. I set my glass down on the granite counter, taking a slow, deep breath. I smoothed the front of my shirt, squared my shoulders, and walked toward the door, perfectly ready to face the very people whose lives I was about to completely dismantle. I opened the door, and the confrontation began instantly. It was not just Marcus standing on my porch, it was a full family ambush. His mother, Evelyn, stood front and center, clutching her designer handbag. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure condescension. Beside her was Kiara Marcus, sister, wearing a smug grin and leaning against her husband, Chad. Chad was exactly the kind of man I despised. A Wall Street finance bro who wore expensive suits and loved explaining basic economics to me as if I were a child. The sheer audacity of them showing up at my house unannounced was staggering. Evelyn pushed past me into the entryway without waiting for an invitation. She slammed a thick manila folder onto my console table, knocking over a small stack of mail. "Sign it, Maya," she demanded, her voice sharp and unapologetic. "It is a divorce decree and a non-disclosure agreement. You are going to sign both of them right now." I looked from Evelyn to Marcus, who was standing near the door, looking surprisingly nervous. "What is this?" I asked, my voice perfectly calm despite the adrenaline rushing through my veins. Evelyn crossed her arms. "You know exactly what this is. Marcus deserves a woman who can elevate him. A billionaire. CEO, like Victoria. Not a woman who smells like shea butter and ships homemade soap from a garage. You have been holding him back for 7 years, Maya. It is time for you to let him go." Kiara chimed in, her tone dripping with fake sympathy. "Honestly, Maya, you should be grateful. Marcus is willing to settle this quietly. It is embarrassing enough for him to have a wife who plays at running a business while he is out building a real career." Chad stepped forward, adjusting his Rolex with an arrogant smirk. He looked around my house as if evaluating its worth. "Listen to them, sweetie," he said, his voice laced with unearned confidence. "Just sign the papers. Marcus is being generous. He is letting you keep the old Honda and all your little soap supplies. Do not even think about fighting for a piece of his Novatech stock options. My firm has a team of Wall Street lawyers who will bury you in paperwork until you are living on the street. You do not want to play macroeconomics with me. It is a game you will lose." I looked at Chad, then at Marcus. The man I had loved, the man I had supported while he struggled through his early career, was now hiding behind his mother and his brother-in-law. He really believed he held all the power. He actually thought his stock options were the most valuable asset in our marriage. The delusion was almost comical. I picked up the pen Evelyn had provided. It felt heavy in my hand, but my resolve was absolute. I did not argue. I did not cry. I did not try to defend my business or my worth. I simply flipped to the signature page of the divorce decree and the non-disclosure agreement. I scanned the documents quickly, ensuring they contained the standard clauses waiving all rights to his assets and protecting his privacy. They were standard boilerplate agreements drafted by someone who clearly underestimated my financial literacy. With a steady hand, I signed my name on both documents, waiving my rights to Marcus' assets forever. Evelyn snatched the papers off the table the moment my pen lifted, a triumphant smile spreading across her face. "Good girl," she said, her tone condescending. Now pack your things. We expect you out of this house by the end of the week. Chad let out a loud, obnoxious laugh, while Marcus finally looked me in the eye, a mixture of relief and lingering guilt flashing across his face. They turned and marched back out the door, piling into Chad's luxury SUV. I stood in the doorway, watching them drive away into the pouring rain. The taillights disappeared around the corner, leaving me alone in the sudden silence of the house. I locked the door and walked back to the console table. I picked up the pen I had just used and twirled it between my fingers. "Chad," I whispered to the empty hallway, a cold smile playing on my lips. "You just helped your brother-in-law legally sign away any marital right to my $678 million. Thank you very much for your fantastic macroeconomic advice, you absolute fool." The relief was profound, not just because I was free of Marcus, but because his arrogance had blinded him to the reality of our financial situation. The non-disclosure agreement he had forced me to sign was mutual. It protected his secrets, but it also protected mine, and my secrets were worth far more than his Novatech stock options. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of wine. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a deep, quiet satisfaction. I had spent 7 years playing the role of the supportive, unassuming wife, keeping my true success hidden to protect his fragile ego. Now that facade was gone, I was no longer Maya the soap maker. I was Maya the founder of Apex Holdings, and I was about to dismantle his entire world. The first step was securing my assets. I had already initiated the withdrawal of my 86% stake in Novatech, but the process would take a few days to finalize. In the meantime, I needed to ensure my personal finances were untouchable. I logged into my private banking portal, verifying that the transfer of my personal funds to a secure offshore account was complete. The joint accounts I shared with Marcus were frozen, leaving him with exactly $42.15. The reality of his situation would hit him soon enough. Next, I called my lead attorney, David, a brilliant strategist who had helped me build Apex Holdings from the ground up. "The withdrawal is in motion," I told him, my voice steady. "We need to prepare for the fallout. Victoria will try to fight this. I want a complete audit of Novatech's financials, especially the executive compensation packages. Leave no stone unturned." "Understood, Maya," David replied, his tone professional and reassuring. "We are already reviewing the public filings. Victoria has been reckless with company funds. The audit will expose everything." I ended the call feeling a surge of anticipation. The battle lines were drawn and I held all the heavy artillery. Marcus and Victoria thought they had won, but they had only just begun to lose. I spent the rest of the evening packing a small bag. I had no intention of staying in the house Marcus claimed to own. It was time to relocate to a place where I could orchestrate my next moves without interference. I booked a suite at a luxury hotel downtown, a place where Marcus and his family would never think to look for me. The rain had stopped by the time I loaded my bag into my car. The night air was cool and crisp, a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of the house I had just left. As I drove toward the city, the lights of the skyline reflecting in the wet pavement, I felt a profound sense of liberation. The woman who had allowed herself to be diminished and disrespected was gone. In her place was a woman who knew her worth and possessed the power to demand it. The next morning, I woke up in my hotel suite feeling refreshed and ready for war. My phone had been silent all night, a welcome reprieve from the relentless ringing of the previous day. But as I poured myself a cup of coffee, the screen lit up with a notification from my bank. The joint accounts had been accessed. Marcus had tried to withdraw funds. The denial code flashed on my screen: insufficient funds. A slow smile spread across my face. The first domino had fallen and the rest were about to follow. I opened my laptop and began reviewing the preliminary audit reports David had sent over. The documents revealed a disturbing pattern of financial mismanagement at Novatech. Victoria's executive compensation package was exorbitant, and the company was bleeding cash. The $50 million loan Chad had secured for them was a desperate attempt to stay afloat, a house of cards waiting to collapse. And I was the wind that was about to blow it down. The arrogance of Marcus and his family was their fatal flaw. They had underestimated me, dismissed me, and ultimately handed me the weapon I needed to destroy them. The divorce papers they forced me to sign were not a defeat. They were a declaration of independence. Non-disclosure agreement was not a gag order. It was a shield. My $678 million was safe, and their precious Novatech was on the brink of ruin. The game had changed, and I was the one making the rules now. The countdown to their destruction had begun, and I was going to enjoy every second of it. Exactly 1 month passed since that rainy afternoon. My financial team had been working silently and efficiently behind the scenes. Apex Holdings had completely severed its capital pipeline to Novatech. The forensic audit I triggered was already unearthing a mountain of corporate irregularities, but the resulting tidal wave had not yet crashed down on Marcus or his precious CEO. They were still living in their delusional bubble of high society prestige, completely unaware that the oxygen was about to be cut off. Then my phone chimed with a text message from Evelyn. It was a summons disguised as a polite request. She demanded I attend her famous Sunday dinner to collect a stack of my mail that had supposedly been misdelivered to her address. I knew exactly what this was. Evelyn did not care about my mail. She wanted an audience. She wanted a front row seat to my humiliation so she could parade her son's massive upgrade in front of the entire family. I decided to give her exactly what she wanted. I dressed in a simple tailored beige blouse and a pair of slacks, keeping my demeanor as unassuming as the soap maker they all thought I was. When I arrived at Evelyn's sprawling colonial home, the heavy scent of pot roast and roasted vegetables hit me the second I walked through the door. The sound of clinking crystal and loud laughter echoed from the formal dining room. I walked in and stopped at the threshold, taking in the scene. The family dynamic had been entirely rearranged. Victoria was sitting at the absolute head of the table, a spot previously reserved strictly for Evelyn's late husband. She looked perfectly polished, in a designer silk dress, sipping a glass of imported red wine. Marcus sat on her right, practically leaning over her chair like an eager servant. Evelyn was on her left, beaming with pride as she offered Victoria another serving of garlic mashed potatoes. Kiara and Chad sat further down, looking thoroughly pleased with the new family hierarchy. "Maya, you actually showed up?" Kiara said loudly, her voice dripping with fake astonishment. "Grab a plate from the kitchen and pull up a folding chair. We did not expect you to stay to eat." I ignored Kiara and walked straight toward Evelyn, holding out my hand. "My mail, please." Evelyn waved her hand dismissively, her heavy gold bracelets clanking together. "It is on the counter somewhere, Maya. But since you are here, sit down. Victoria has something she wants to discuss with you. It is highly important business." Victoria set her wineglass down on the mahogany table and wiped her mouth with a linen napkin. She looked at me with the kind of pity reserved for stray animals. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a thick, crisp white envelope. With a manicured finger, she slid it slowly across the polished wood until it stopped right in front of me. I looked down at the envelope but did not touch it. "What is this?" I asked, my voice steady. Victoria smiled a tight, condescending expression. "It is $10,000, Maya. Consider it a charitable donation from Marcus and me to help you get back on your feet. I know your little craft business does not generate real income, and we do not want you ending up in a homeless shelter." Marcus leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms defensively. "We are being more than fair, Maya. We want to start our new life together, without any messy loose ends holding us back. Take the cash and consider it a parting gift." "And what exactly am I supposed to do in exchange for this incredible generosity?" I asked, keeping my face perfectly blank. Victoria leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "You are going to pack whatever junk you have left and vacate the house by Friday. Marcus and I have decided we do not want to live in a stale, outdated suburban box tainted by the memory of a failed marriage. We have already hired a demolition crew. We are tearing the entire property down to build a custom smart mansion. The architects need access to the lot by Monday morning." Kiara chimed in immediately, eagerly passing a gravy boat to Chad. You really should take the money, Maya. $10,000 is a fortune for someone like you. You can finally afford to buy something other than those embarrassing thrift store dresses you wear. You have been making us look like peasants every single Sunday at Pastor Davis Church for years. It is honestly a relief that Victoria will be sitting in our family pew from now on. Evelyn nodded enthusiastically in agreement. Kiara is right. A man of Marcus status needs a woman who looks the part. Victoria brings grace and generational wealth to this family. You brought Tupperware containers filled with cheap homemade soup. It is time for you to accept reality and move on gracefully. Take the money, Maya. Do not make this harder than it has to be. I stood there letting their insults hang in the warm air of the dining room. I looked at Evelyn's smug face, Kiara's mocking grin, Chad's arrogant smirk, Marcus' cowardly posture, and Victoria's absolute certainty that her money could buy my obedience. They had painted a perfect picture of their own supremacy. They thought I was trapped, backed into a corner with absolutely zero leverage. I slowly reached out and picked up the envelope. It felt heavy with cash. Victoria's smile widened into a triumphant grin, assuming I had surrendered. Instead of putting it in my purse, I casually tossed the envelope right back across the table. It slid directly into Victoria's plate of pot roast, soaking up the dark brown gravy. Victoria's gasp echoed loudly in the room. "What is wrong with you?" she snapped, snatching the ruined envelope out of her food. I calmly reached over, picked up Marcus' unattended glass of sweet tea, and took a slow, deliberate sip. The ice clinked against the crystal as I set it back down. "Keep your charity, Victoria," I said, my voice dropping to a low, chilling register. "I am not leaving by Friday. And Marcus, you cannot demolish this house." Chad let out a loud, barking laugh that bounced off the dining room walls. He picked up his heavy silver steak knife and began sawing into his prime rib, shaking his head. He looked at me like I was a toddler who had just tried to explain quantum physics. "Maya, this is real estate," he said, chewing his food with his mouth slightly open. "It is macroeconomics. It is about capital and asset leveraging. Things you clearly do not understand while you are busy measuring out lavender oil and wrapping bars of soap in brown paper. Marcus holds the deed to that property. He is the sole owner. You signed away your marital rights to his assets this afternoon. You have zero equity, zero leverage. Stick to selling bath bombs and let the adults handle the multi-million-dollar property developments." Evelyn smiled proudly at her son-in-law. "Chad is right, Maya. Marcus worked hard to buy that beautiful home. It is his to do with as he pleases. And Victoria has hired the best architects in the state to build their new life." Kiara pointed her fork at me. "Exactly. You should be thanking them for giving you $10,000. With your zero credit history and your little craft fair income, you will be lucky to qualify for a studio apartment in a bad neighborhood." I sat perfectly still, letting their arrogance fill the room. I waited until Chad took another smug bite of his steak. Then I reached into my leather handbag. I did not pull out a tissue or a handkerchief to dry my eyes. I pulled out a thick, legally binding document stamped with a gold notary seal. I held it for a brief second, letting the heavy silence stretch across the table. Then I tossed it directly across the mahogany wood. It landed right in the center of Chad's dinner plate. Dark brown gravy splashed up, staining the crisp white cuffs of his custom-tailored shirt. "Hey, what is wrong with you?" Chad yelled, dropping his knife and jumping back from the table. I ignored his outburst and leaned forward, resting my arms on the table. "Read it, Chad. Since you are the resident expert on macroeconomics and asset leveraging, read the name of the LLC that holds the deed to the house Marcus claims he owns." Chad glared at me, wiping his sleeve with a napkin, but his eyes flicked down to the document. He pulled it out of the gravy, holding it by the edges. His eyes scanned the bold print at the top of the page. He frowned, his thick eyebrows pulling together in confusion. "What is this?" he muttered. "It says the property is wholly owned by Apex Holdings LLC through a blind trust." Victoria suddenly went rigid in her chair. She knew the name Apex Holdings. It was the exact same venture capital firm that funded her entire company. Her eyes darted from me to Marcus. "Marcus, what is she talking about?" Victoria demanded, her voice sharp. You told me you owned the house free and clear. Marcus looked like he had just swallowed a stone. I do own it, he stammered, looking frantically at his mother. I bought it 7 years ago. The bank just restructured the loan a few years back. They did not restructure your loan, Marcus, I said, my voice cutting through the room like a blade. You defaulted on it. The entire table froze. I kept my eyes locked on my husband, watching the color drain from his face. 5 years ago, you decided you needed to impress Chad and your country club friends. I continued, my tone calm and lethal. You went behind my back and bought that sports car you could not afford. You maxed out your credit cards trying to keep up with men who actually had generational wealth. And when the bank sent the foreclosure notice on the house, you hid it from me. You thought you could fix it, but you failed. Evelyn gasped, clutching the edge of the table. That is a lie. My son is a brilliant provider. He is a financial liability, Evelyn. I fired back. When the bank was 2 days away from seizing the property and throwing us out into the street, I stepped in. I paid off the entire mortgage in cash through a blind trust. I bought the debt. I bought the deed. I bought the very roof over his head. Chad stared at the paper in his hands, his face turning a sickly shade of pale. He looked at the signature on the bottom of the deed and then looked up at me, his jaw slightly slack. You, he whispered. You are the sole managing director of the trust. Congratulations, Chad. Your reading comprehension is improving, I said, leaning back in my chair. You see, Marcus never bothered to read the restructuring paperwork he signed 5 years ago. He was just so relieved that a mysterious corporate entity bailed him out that he signed blindly. He has been paying monthly rent directly to my holding company ever since. I am the landlord. I own the house. I own the land it sits on. Victoria turned furiously toward Marcus. You lied to me, she hissed. You told me you had millions in real estate equity. You told me we could demolish the property for the new build. You do not even own the dirt under your feet. Marcus was sweating now, pulling at the collar of his expensive shirt. Victoria, baby, I can explain. It is just a misunderstanding with the paperwork. My lawyers can fix this. Your lawyers cannot fix a legal change of ownership. Marcus, I said, completely devoid of sympathy. And since we are on the topic of moving on, I think it is time we wrap up this lovely Sunday dinner. I stood up slowly, smoothing out the front of my slacks. The power dynamic in the room had shattered. Evelyn was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. Kiara had dropped her fork, her mouth hanging open. Chad was still staring at the gravy-stained deed as if it were a bomb about to detonate. What do you mean, wrap it up? Evelyn demanded, her voice shaking. I looked directly at Marcus. I mean, you need to leave, Marcus. Not by Friday. Not tomorrow morning. Right now. Marcus stood up, his face flashing from panic to pure anger. You cannot kick me out of my own home, Maya. I have lived there for 7 years. I have rights. You signed away all your rights this afternoon, remember? I reminded him, gesturing to the spot where Evelyn had shoved the divorce papers at me. You and Chad were so eager to protect your non-existent Novatech stock options that you legally waived any claim to my assets. And the house is my asset. I picked up my purse and slung it over my shoulder. I already called a team of professional movers while I was sitting in my car, ignoring your 132 missed calls. They have been working very efficiently for the last 2 hours. They packed all your custom suits, your expensive watches, and your golf clubs. They are currently sitting in cardboard boxes on the front lawn. Marcus took a step back, bumping into his chair. You are lying. You would not do that. Check your phone, Marcus. I am sure your neighbors have been sending you pictures of the spectacle. Get out of my house. And please take your $10,000 gravy-soaked charity with you, Victoria. You are going to need it to pay for his hotel room tonight. I turned around and walked out of the formal dining room, leaving them choking on the ashes of their own arrogance. I did not look back. I did not need to. The sound of Victoria's furious screaming echoing down the hallway was all the confirmation I needed. The house was mine, the money was mine, and the war had only just begun. I pushed open the heavy front door and stepped out into the cool evening air, breathing in the sweet scent of absolute victory. The next phase of my plan was already in motion, and Chad was about to learn a very painful lesson about supply and demand. The crisp Monday morning air felt electric as I pulled my rental car into the industrial park, where I kept my soap and candle warehouse. This small brick building had been my perfect alibi for 7 years. It was modest, unpretentious, and exactly the kind of place Marcus and his family would mock. To them, it was a monument to my lack of ambition. To me, it was the perfect camouflage for a woman quietly managing a global venture capital firm from a secure laptop in the back office. I parked in my usual spot and grabbed my coffee, but as I walked up to the heavy metal door, my steps slowed. A bright yellow legal document was plastered right at eye level, secured with thick strips of packing tape. I peeled it off and scanned the bold legal jargon. It was a cease and desist order, followed by a temporary injunction. Victoria had not wasted any time. Furious over being humiliated at Sunday dinner, she had run straight to her family's team of high-priced litigators. The document claimed that the initial seed money for my soap business had been embezzled from Novatech corporate accounts, using Marcus as an unwitting conduit. It was an absolute fabrication, a blatant lie designed to financially paralyze me. Victoria was flexing her old money muscles using her family connections to bypass standard legal procedures and secure an immediate freeze on my assets. My phone vibrated in my pocket, confirming her maneuver. An automated alert from the local credit union informed me that the business account tied to my soap company had been suspended pending a fraud investigation. Victoria actually thought she had just severed my only financial lifeline. She thought she had left me destitute, locked out of my home, and entirely unable to defend myself against her corporate machine. The screen of my phone lit up again this time, showing a missed call and a new voicemail from Evelyn. I leaned against the brick wall of the warehouse, took a sip of my coffee, and hit play. Evelyn did not bother with a greeting. Her voice was shrill with triumphant malice. "Maya, I hope you are enjoying the reality check this morning. You thought you could walk into my home, disrespect my son, and embarrass Victoria without consequences. You clearly do not understand how the real world works. You mess with a lioness, you get bitten." Victoria made one phone call to a judge her father plays golf with, and just like that, your little hobby is shut down. Marcus is already working with her lawyers to ensure you do not see a single dime in alimony. I suggest you take that $10,000 we offered and buy a bus ticket back to whatever neighborhood you came from. Do not ever try to cross our family again. The voicemail ended with a sharp click. I lowered the phone, shaking my head at the sheer delusion radiating from every word. They were so blinded by their own perceived status that they could not see the massive trap closing in around them. Victoria thought she was swatting a fly. She had no idea she had just declared war on the entity that held the mortgage to her entire corporate existence. I did not panic. I did not feel the crushing despair Evelyn so desperately wanted me to feel. Instead, I felt a cold, sharp thrill. Victoria wanted to play corporate warfare. She wanted to weaponize the legal system to starve me out. It was a bold move, but it was also incredibly sloppy. I unlocked the warehouse door and stepped into the quiet space, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender and eucalyptus. I walked straight to the back office, booted up my encrypted laptop, and dialed my lead attorney. David answered on the first ring. "Good morning, Maya." David said, his tone brisk and ready for action. "The Novatech withdrawal is proceeding perfectly. We are preparing the final notices for their board of directors now." "Pause the withdrawal notice for just a moment, David," I instructed, pulling up the scanned copy of the injunction Victoria had just served me. Victoria decided to expedite the hostilities. She just used her old money connections to freeze the bank account for my soap business. She filed an injunction claiming I stole corporate assets from Marcus to fund my company. David let out a sharp laugh of disbelief. "She froze a retail account with maybe $50,000 in it while you are currently pulling $678 million of operational capital out of her firm. The irony is staggering. Should I have our litigators squash the injunction? It will take me exactly 10 minutes to prove her claims are entirely fabricated." "No," I said, smiling at the screen. "Let her keep the injunction for now. Let her feel like she is winning. I want her completely distracted while we execute the real strike. If Victoria wants to throw around accusations of corporate theft, I think it is only fair we look into her own spending habits." "What do you have in mind?" David asked, his voice shifting into a predatory cadence. I thought back to the Novatech lobby, to the massive 5-carat diamond ring Marcus had slid onto Victoria's finger. Marcus was severely in debt. He did not have the capital to purchase a ring worth $500,000, and Victoria was too arrogant to buy her own engagement ring. The money had to come from somewhere inside the company. David, I want you to initiate an immediate targeted audit of Novatech's employee pension fund. I commanded, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Cross-reference their recent executive disbursements with any luxury purchases made by Marcus or Victoria in the last month. Let us see exactly where she got the money for that diamond ring she is flashing around town. David agreed immediately, promising to have his team of forensic accountants rip into the Novatech ledgers before the end of the day. The trap was officially set, and all I had to do was wait for them to walk right into it. That opportunity arrived exactly 3 days later at a mandatory mediation session required by the divorce filings. The meeting was held in a sterile high-rise legal office downtown, overlooking the city skyline. I walked into the glass-walled conference room, carrying only a single black leather briefcase. I took my seat on one side of the massive mahogany table, perfectly calm and entirely unbothered. Sitting across from me, acting as if they had already won the war, was the unholy trinity of my soon-to-be ex-family. Marcus was wearing a brand-new custom-tailored suit that I knew he could not afford. Victoria sat right beside him, practically draped over his arm, flashing that massive fraudulent diamond ring under the fluorescent lights. And anchoring their side of the table was Chad. He had officially inserted himself into the proceedings, acting as Marcus' personal financial advisor. He wore a smug, self-satisfied grin, leaning back in his leather chair with his hands steeped under his chin. A neutral third-party mediator sat at the head of the table, looking completely overwhelmed by the sheer arrogance radiating from their side of the room. The mediator cleared his throat and attempted to begin the session by outlining the standard procedures for dividing marital assets. Chad did not even let the poor man finish his opening sentence. "Let us save everyone some billable hours here," Chad interrupted, throwing a hand up dismissively. He leaned forward, unbuttoning his suit jacket so his heavy gold Rolex caught the light. "We all know why we are here. Maya is currently locked out of her only source of income." Chad picked up a single sheet of paper from the stack in front of him and slid it across the smooth wooden table. It glided to a stop exactly 2 inches from my hands. It was a formal settlement offer. "Take a good look at that," Chad said, his voice dripping with condescension. "It is a check for $15,000. Now, I know you do not understand high-level finance, but let me break this down into terms you can grasp. You have zero liquidity right now. We checked your little soap company accounts. Victoria was entirely within her rights as CEO to freeze those funds pending a corporate theft investigation. Your business is paralyzed. Your credit cards are maxed out. You are completely and utterly broke." Victoria let out a soft, elegant sigh, resting her manicured hand over Marcus' arm. "We are truly trying to be reasonable, Maya. I had to protect my company from your financial misconduct, but Marcus convinced me to show you some mercy. We know you are struggling. We know you have nothing else to fall back on. Take the $15,000. It is more than enough for you to rent a small apartment and start over somewhere else, somewhere more suited to your lifestyle." I looked down at the paper. $15,000. They were trying to buy my silence and my compliance with the equivalent of loose change. I kept my face entirely neutral, refusing to give them the reaction they were so desperately craving. "You cannot win this," Chad continued, leaning his elbows on the table and pointing a finger at me. "I told you before, this is macroeconomics. You are outmatched, outgunned, and out of money. If you try to drag this out in court, Victoria's legal team will bury you in endless litigation. You will be drowning in legal fees before a judge even looks at your case. Sign the settlement, take the cash, walk away before you end up with absolutely nothing." I slowly raised my eyes from the settlement offer and looked directly at Marcus. He had been sitting quietly, letting his brother-in-law and his mistress do all the heavy lifting. But the silence from my end of the table seemed to embolden him. He puffed out his chest, adjusting his silk tie and looking at me with pure, unadulterated disdain. "Just sign the paper." Maya Marcus scoffed, shaking his head as if my very presence was an exhausting burden. Stop trying to drag this out. You have always been completely out of your depth in my world. You bring absolutely nothing of value to this family, and you never have. He leaned forward, planting his hands flat on the table, his voice turning vicious. Let me remind you of exactly who you are, Maya. Do you remember when my mother was in the intensive care unit 3 years ago? Do you remember how terrified we all were when her heart started failing? I remembered it perfectly. I remembered the sterile smell of the hospital waiting room, the blinding panic on Evelyn's face, and the way Marcus had completely fallen apart, unable to handle the pressure. Victoria was just my boss back then, Marcus continued, his voice rising with theatrical indignation. But when she heard about my mother, she stepped up. She used her old money family connections and pulled strings with the hospital board. She got my mother the absolute best cardiovascular surgeon in the entire state. Victoria literally saved my mother's life with one single phone call. Marcus let out a cruel, mocking laugh, pointing a finger at me. And what did you do, Maya? You showed up to the intensive care unit wearing a cheap sweater, carrying a plastic Tupperware container filled with homemade chicken soup. My mother was fighting for her life, and you brought soup. That is the difference between you and Victoria. Victoria moves mountains. She commands respect. She wields real power. You make soup, and you make soap. You were just a placeholder until I found a woman who is actually on my level. Sign the paper, Maya. Take your $15,000 and get out of our lives. The room fell dead silent. Chad smirked, crossing his arms in triumph. Victoria offered Marcus a sympathetic smile, patting his shoulder as if he had just delivered a brilliant legal argument. The mediator looked down at his notes, shifting uncomfortably in his chair, completely appalled by the blatant cruelty he had just witnessed. They thought they had broken me. They thought bringing up Evelyn's illness, throwing Victoria's supposed wealth in my face, and humiliating me in front of strangers would force my hand. They truly believed I was nothing more than a helpless, pathetic woman sitting across from a dynasty she could not possibly fight. I looked at the $15,000 settlement offer. I looked at Chad's smug face. I looked at Victoria's stolen diamond ring. And finally, I looked at Marcus, the man who had just proudly rewriting history to elevate his own fragile ego. I did not scream. I did not throw the paper back in their faces. Instead, a slow, genuinely amused smile spread across my lips. Is that so? I asked, my voice echoing softly in the quiet room. I reached down and unlatched the brass clasps of my leather briefcase. The metallic snap of my briefcase unlatching echoed loudly in the stunned silence of the conference room. Everyone watched closely as I lifted the lid and pulled out a thick, heavily bound ledger bearing the unmistakable official seal of Massachusetts General Hospital. I did not throw it. I placed it gently on the center of the table, right on top of Chad's insultingly low settlement offer. I placed my hand flat over the cover and slid it deliberately toward Marcus. He stared at it as if it were a live explosive device. Open it, Marcus, I instructed, my voice completely devoid of any warmth or hesitation. Turn to page 4. Look at the itemized billing for your mother's double bypass surgery from 3 years ago. Marcus hesitated, his eyes darting to Victoria for permission or perhaps rescue. When she offered nothing but a confused, tightened glare, he reached out with trembling fingers and flipped the heavy pages. His eyes scanned the dense columns of medical codes and financial figures. Read the total balance, I commanded, leaning forward slightly to hold his gaze. $150,000. He mumbled, his voice barely a whisper against the quiet hum of the air conditioning. And read the payment history. I pushed, my tone dropping to a sharp interrogative rhythm. Who paid it, Marcus? Who cleared that massive unpayable debt while you were busy hiding your sports car foreclosure from me? Who stepped up when your mother was lying in a hospital bed attached to a ventilator? He swallowed hard, a bead of sweat forming at his temple. It says paid in full by the Lotus Foundation. I smiled, a cold, humorless expression that made Chad physically recoil in his chair. Exactly. The Lotus Foundation. Did you ever bother to look up the corporate structure of that charity, Marcus? Did you ever wonder who actually funded it? No, you did not, because you were too busy mocking my ambition. The Lotus Foundation is the philanthropic arm of Apex Holdings. It is funded entirely by the profits of my little soap company. That cheap soup I brought to the intensive care unit was not the only thing I contributed to your mother's survival. I turned my gaze to Victoria, who was now sitting rigidly in her chair, the color draining from her cheeks. Victoria did not pay a single dime toward your mother's surgery, Marcus. She made a phone call. She leveraged her family name to secure the surgical suite, but when the hospital administration demanded actual proof of financial backing to proceed with the operation, she flatly refused to sign as a guarantor. She left your mother to die because she did not want to risk a fraction of her own capital on an employee's parent. I paid the bill. I saved your mother. You bring nothing of value to this family, is what you just proudly said to me. I bought your mother's life with the money I made from measuring lavender oil and wrapping bars of soap in brown paper. The impact on Marcus was immediate and absolute. He looked like the floor had just vanished beneath his feet. He turned to Victoria, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly as the illusion of his perfect, powerful savior shattered into pieces. He had worshipped her for saving his family, and now he was staring at the undeniable truth that she had done absolutely nothing. Victoria's perfect porcelain mask cracked wide open. The cool, collected CEO vanished entirely, replaced by a cornered, furious, desperate animal. "This is a complete and utter fabrication," Victoria shrieked, slamming her fist down on the mahogany table with such force that her water glass tipped over, spilling ice across the polished wood. She stood up violently, knocking her heavy leather chair backward. "You forged these documents. You are a pathological liar and a bitter ex-wife trying to extort us." She whirled around to face the team of highly paid corporate lawyers sitting silently behind her. "I want her sued for defamation right now," Victoria screamed, her voice echoing shrilly against the glass walls of the conference room. "I want a gag order. I want her sued for corporate espionage, fraud, and slander. Do not just sit there looking stupid, draft the paperwork. She is trying to ruin my reputation with these insane lies." Chad was frantically typing on his phone, his face pale as he desperately tried to verify the Lotus Foundation's ownership records online. The mediator tried to raise his hands to restore order, but the room had already descended into absolute chaos. I remained perfectly seated, entirely unfazed by Victoria's theatrical meltdown. I did not even need to speak. The heavy glass door of the conference room swung open, and the dynamic of the room shifted in an instant. Stepping through the doorway was Naomi, my lead litigation attorney, and the absolute sharpest legal mind on the Eastern Seaboard. She was a striking black woman who commanded supreme authority the second she entered any room, wearing a flawless tailored crimson suit and carrying an immaculate leather folio. She walked straight to my side of the table, moving with the predatory grace of a shark smelling blood in the water. Naomi placed her folio on the table and looked directly at Victoria. Her gaze was piercing, sharp enough to cut through steel. "Before you instruct your legal counsel to file a frivolous defamation suit against my client Victoria, you might want to reconsider your immediate priorities," Naomi said, her voice smooth, calm, and absolutely terrifying. Victoria froze, her hand hovering in midair, her chest heaving. "Who do you think you are?" she snapped, attempting to regain her superior posture. Naomi did not blink. "I am the attorney currently preparing a highly detailed, comprehensive brief for the Securities and Exchange Commission," Naomi replied, tapping her manicured fingernail rhythmically against her leather folio. "We have spent the last 48 hours conducting a forensic audit of the Novatech corporate accounts. It yielded some truly fascinating reading material regarding your recent financial maneuvers." Naomi looked pointedly at the massive diamond ring gleaming brightly on Victoria's left hand. "For instance, we found a highly irregular capital withdrawal initiated exactly 3 weeks ago. A withdrawal that coincidentally matches the exact purchase price of that stunning 5-carat engagement ring you are currently flaunting." Marcus turned a sickly shade of gray, his eyes dropping to the ring he thought he had purchased. Victoria swallowed hard, her aggressive posture instantly deflating as genuine terror washed over her face. Naomi leaned forward, resting her hands on the table, locking eyes with the crumbling CEO. You might want to explain to the SEC and your board of directors exactly why the serial number on your new engagement ring perfectly matches a purchase made directly from the Novatech Employee Retirement Pension Fund. Victoria stood completely frozen, trapped in the suffocating silence of her own absolute destruction. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Marcus looked from Naomi to Victoria, his eyes wide with a horrifying realization that his new billionaire savior was actually a corporate thief about to be indicted by the federal government. Chad had stopped typing on his phone entirely, his face buried in his hands. The mediator quietly closed his folder, signaling that this session was officially over. Naomi did not offer a polite goodbye or a professional handshake. She simply snapped her leather folio shut, gave me a crisp approving nod, and walked out of the glass-walled room. I stood up, buttoned my suit jacket, and left the unholy trinity sitting in the absolute wreckage of their own making. The financial and legal war was definitively won, but I knew Marcus and his family too well. When they lost on paper, they always resorted to dirty social tactics. They needed to control the narrative to protect their fragile egos and their public standing. I fully expected retaliation, but I did not anticipate how low Evelyn was willing to stoop to preserve her son's reputation. By Thursday, rumors began circulating through my neighborhood. By Friday, I was receiving texts from casual acquaintances asking if I was mentally stable. But it was not until Sunday morning that I saw the full extent of their desperate smear campaign. Evelyn had gone straight to the one place where she held the most social capital: our church. She had marched right into Pastor Davis' office armed with crocodile tears and a carefully fabricated story. She painted me as an unhinged, vindictive ex-wife who could not handle losing a successful man. She twisted the narrative of the house eviction, claiming I had used fraudulent legal loopholes to throw her poor son out onto the street. She completely omitted Victoria's embezzlement and instead spun a tale of a God-ordained relationship between Marcus and Victoria that I was trying to destroy out of pure bitter jealousy. Evelyn told the pastor I was having a mental breakdown and desperately needed spiritual intervention before I harmed myself or others. I pulled my car into the packed church parking lot on Sunday morning, perfectly aware of the ambush waiting inside. For 7 years, I had sat in the fourth row wearing the modest thrift store dresses Evelyn deemed appropriate for a simple soap maker. Today, I wore a tailored charcoal pantsuit and a pair of emerald green heels that cost more than Evelyn's entire Sunday wardrobe. I walked through the heavy oak doors of the sanctuary holding my head high. The reaction was immediate and undeniable. The lively pre-service chatter abruptly died down as I walked down the center aisle. Heads turned, eyes glared. Women I had baked casseroles with for church fundraisers suddenly found the stained glass windows absolutely fascinating, avoiding my gaze entirely. Whispers rippled through the wooden pews like a sudden draft of cold air. I spotted Kiara and Chad sitting near the front. Kiara leaned over and whispered something to a prominent church elder, pointing a manicured finger directly in my direction. Chad sat back with a smug, satisfied grin, thoroughly enjoying the social execution his mother-in-law had orchestrated. Marcus and Victoria were conveniently absent, likely playing the deeply traumatized victims, hiding away from my supposed wrath to garner even more sympathy. Evelyn sat proudly in the center of her pew, dabbing her dry eyes with a lace tissue, playing the role of the heartbroken matriarch to absolute perfection. I did not flinch. I did not turn around and run. I walked straight to my usual pew, right across the aisle from Evelyn, and sat down with perfect composure, crossing my legs and resting my hands in my lap. The choir finished their opening hymn and Pastor Davis stepped up to the massive wooden pulpit. He adjusted his microphone and looked out over the congregation, his eyes landing heavily and deliberately on me. He opened his leather-bound Bible, but he did not read from it. Instead, he launched into a fiery, impassioned sermon that was so clearly directed at me he might as well have shouted my name through the sound system. He spoke about the dangerous poison of jealousy. He paced across the stage, his voice booming through the speakers, warning the congregation about the bitterness of a scorned woman who refuses to accept God's will. He talked about how true grace meant letting go of successful men when the Lord called them to a higher purpose and a higher union. He actually used the phrase God-ordained relationship to describe Marcus and his embezzling mistress. He looked directly into my eyes and preached about the severe spiritual consequences of trying to tear down a good, upstanding family simply because you were no longer worthy to be part of it. He urged the congregation to pray for those lost in vindictive rage who use the legal system to inflict pain on innocent people. The entire congregation sat in rapt attention, occasionally nodding and casting judgmental glances my way. They were eating up every single word of Evelyn's fabricated victimhood. They expected me to break under the immense social pressure. They expected me to lower my head in shame, burst into tears, and run down the aisle in utter humiliation. Evelyn was practically vibrating with malicious joy in the pew across from me, waiting for my inevitable public surrender. I sat perfectly still, my posture flawless, my expression entirely unbothered. I let the pastor finish his 20-minute character assassination without breaking eye contact with him once. When he finally stepped back from the pulpit, wiping sweat from his forehead, the sanctuary fell into a heavy, expectant silence. The organist began to play a soft instrumental hymn, signaling the time for the weekly tithes and offerings. The head ushers stepped forward, grabbing the velvet-lined collection plates to pass through the rows. The congregation rustled, reaching for their wallets and envelopes, preparing to give their weekly donations. I watched the head usher moving slowly down the aisle toward my row, holding the brass plate. Evelyn leaned forward slightly, a mocking smirk playing on her lips, clearly eager to see what the broke soapmaker was going to drop into the offering. She thought she had successfully stripped me of my dignity, my community, and my reputation. She thought this public shaming was the final nail in my coffin. I smiled calmly. I did not reach for a crumpled $10 bill or a handful of loose change to drop into the velvet bowl. I reached directly into my designer bag and pulled out something that was going to permanently alter the financial landscape of this entire congregation and expose Evelyn's lies once and for all. I pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope sealed with a tight metal clasp. The head usher paused, holding the velvet-lined collection plate out to me, with a polite but strained smile. He expected a folded check. He expected a token of submission from the humiliated woman sitting alone in the fourth row. Instead, I bypassed his velvet plate entirely. I stood up, my emerald green heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floor of the sanctuary. The organ music seemed to falter for a fraction of a second as the organist noticed the sudden movement. Evelyn's face twisted into a mask of pure confusion. I stepped out of the pew and began walking straight down the center aisle toward the raised stage. I did not rush. I took my time, letting the entire congregation watch me. Pastor Davis had just finished condemning me to eternal damnation, and now here I was marching right up to his pulpit. The whispers erupted immediately. Hushed, frantic voices buzzing from every direction, bouncing off the beautiful stained glass windows. I could feel Kiara glaring holes into my back, but I kept my eyes locked directly on the pastor. He was standing near the altar, adjusting his robes, looking entirely unsure of how to handle a woman who refused to bow her head and play the victim. I reached the front of the sanctuary where the main collection plates rested on a carved wooden communion table. Pastor Davis stepped forward, holding up a hand as if to stop a rogue wave from crashing into his peaceful service. "Sister Maya," he started, his voice booming slightly without the microphone attempting to assert his authority. "This is a time for quiet reflection and giving. Please return to your seat and let the ushers do their work." I smiled at him, an expression so devoid of warmth that he physically took a half step backward. "Oh, I am giving, Pastor Davis," I said, my voice carrying perfectly through the sudden dead silence of the massive room. "I am giving this congregation the exact thing they have been praying for all morning, the absolute unvarnished truth." I dropped the heavy manila envelope directly onto the center collection plate. It hit the brass bottom with a loud, definitive thud that echoed off the high vaulted ceilings. I turned slightly so my voice would project not just to the pastor, but to the first few rows where the church elders sat in their tailored suits. "Pastor Davis, my mother-in-law, Evelyn gave a beautiful prayer request this morning." I began, making sure to enunciate every single syllable. "She spoke about my bitterness. She spoke about Marcus and his incredible success. But she conveniently forgot to mention exactly how her precious son achieved that success. She forgot to mention the events of 5 years ago. I paused, letting the suspense tighten around the room like a snare. The silence was absolutely deafening. 5 years ago, this very church launched a massive fundraising campaign to build the new youth center. You raised over $200,000 from the hardworking families sitting in these pews. But somehow the construction was delayed by 6 months due to an unexpected shortfall. Do you remember that, Pastor Davis? He blinked, thick beads of sweat forming on his brow. I do, he stammered, glancing nervously at the elders sitting in the front row. I kept my gaze pinned on him. Marcus was on the financial planning committee. Back then, I continued, my voice ringing out clear and steady, commanding the space. What Evelyn forgot to include in her touching sermon this morning is that Marcus did not just make a bad investment when he bought his luxury sports car. He embezzled $40,000 directly from this church's building fund. He stole from the offering plate to pay off his underwater auto loans and his elite country club dues. Gasps broke out across the front rows. Several elders sat up straight, their faces turning red with sudden comprehension. I paid it back, I declared, slicing through the rising noise before it could drown me out. I discovered his theft. I liquidated my personal savings from my soap business, and I silently paid back every single dime to this church under the guise of an anonymous corporate donation. I did it to protect Evelyn's fragile heart and to keep Marcus out of federal prison. I protected a man who had stolen from the very altar his mother bows to every Sunday. I protected him, and in return they stood up here today and tried to destroy my name. I turned sharply on my heels, facing the congregation. My eyes locked directly onto Evelyn. She was practically melting into the wooden pew, clutching her chest, as if she were having a genuine cardiac event. Kiara sat completely frozen, her mouth hanging open, her fake pious facade shattered into a million pieces. Chad was staring at the floor, refusing to look anywhere near me. The bank receipts are in the envelope, I said, my voice slicing through the heavy, suffocated air of the sanctuary. I included the original wire transfers, the falsified ledgers Marcus created, and the certified bank checks proving exactly where the missing $40,000 went and exactly who paid it back. I suggest the financial committee review those documents immediately before Evelyn asks for another prayer request. I offered them a bright, razor-sharp smile. Praise the Lord for the truth. The sanctuary absolutely erupted. It was no longer a place of worship, it was a courtroom of public opinion, and the verdict had just been handed down. Dozens of people started talking at once. Church elders were standing up, pointing at the envelope, and then pointing angrily toward Evelyn's pew. The outrage was palpable, a physical force sweeping through the room. And that was when I saw him. Marcus had not stayed home after all. He had sneaked into the back vestibule, standing behind the glass doors to watch my public execution. He had wanted to revel in his mother's handiwork from a safe distance. I watched his face drain of all color through the thick glass. He realized in a split second that his entire reputation, his freedom, and his standing in the community were entirely gone. He spun around and lunged for the heavy brass handles of the exit doors, trying to bolt out into the parking lot. But he was not fast enough. 3 of the senior church elders' men who had personally donated thousands of dollars to the very fund Marcus had robbed were already standing in the back. They stepped directly into his path, blocking the double doors with their broad shoulders. Marcus slammed into them, stumbling backward, his eyes wide with absolute panic as he realized there was no escape. The elders grabbed him by the arms, their faces rigid with righteous fury, hauling him toward Pastor Davis' office to await the authorities. I did not stay to watch the police arrive. I had delivered the truth, and my work in that sanctuary was entirely finished. I walked out into the crisp Sunday air, leaving the toxic ashes of my former family behind me. But a dying snake still possesses venom, and Chad was absolutely furious. His entire identity was wrapped up in his flawless Wall Street reputation. By publicly exposing Marcus as a petty church thief, I had inadvertently humiliated Chad. He was the brilliant financial advisor who had proudly vouched for Marcus, sitting right next to him at the mediation table. He had staked his own professional credibility on Marcus and Victoria. Now his own elite social circle was whispering about how he had aligned himself with an embezzler and a corporate fraud. In Chad's mind, I had made him look like an incompetent fool in front of the entire city, and a man with an ego that fragile does not just walk away. He retaliates. He needed to destroy me, to rebuild his own shattered superiority. He needed to prove that he was the apex predator and I was just the helpless prey. 2 days later, the retaliation hit. I was sitting at my desk reviewing the quarterly expansion projections for our European markets when my office phone began ringing frantically. It was Ben, my lead warehouse manager, and he sounded entirely out of breath. The ambient noise of the factory floor, usually a rhythmic hum of productivity, was eerily silent. Maya. "We have a massive crisis," Ben shouted, his voice echoing in the quiet warehouse. "Our delivery trucks are sitting empty at the loading docks." I sat up straight, opening the inventory tracking software on my monitor. "Calm down, Ben. What exactly is missing?" Everything, he panicked. All three of our primary raw material suppliers just terminated our contracts simultaneously. They pulled the cold-pressed essential oils, the organic lye, and the ethically sourced beeswax. I tried calling their regional directors, but they are stonewalling me reading from some heavily scripted legal jargon about unforeseen market volatility and immediate contract dissolution. "Maya, we cannot run production without those base materials. We have massive international orders to fulfill by the end of the month. The holiday inventory alone requires thousands of gallons of those oils. If we do not get supply trucks moving in the next 48 hours, our production lines will completely halt. We will default on our vendor agreements and face millions in breach of contract penalties." Before I could even process the logistics of three independent suppliers breaking ironclad contracts simultaneously, my personal cell phone lit up on the desk. A new voicemail notification flashed across the screen. The number belonged to Chad. I put Ben on a brief hold, tapped the voicemail icon, and put the audio on speakerphone. Chad's voice echoed through my corner office, dripping with absolute arrogance and unearned superiority. "Hello, Maya," Chad drawled, sounding as though he were leaning back in a leather chair, swirling a glass of expensive scotch. "I heard you had a little supply chain hiccup this morning. I told you before, but you refused to listen. This is macroeconomics. You think you won because you embarrassed Marcus in a church. You think exposing a little embezzlement makes you powerful? You are playing in the shallow end of the pool." His mocking laughter grated against the speaker. "My investment bank underwrites the commercial loans for all three of your major suppliers. I simply made a few phone calls to their executive boards and reminded them that our bank was reviewing their credit lines for the upcoming fiscal year. I suggested that doing business with a volatile, unstable little soap company like yours made them a high-risk investment. They dropped your contracts in a heartbeat to protect their own leverage. You are out of materials. You are out of options. I squeezed your supply chain, Maya. You are completely out of business by Friday. Enjoy bankruptcy." The voicemail clicked dead. Chad truly believed he had dealt the killing blow. He honestly thought I was just a small-time artisan who would collapse the second a Wall Street suit applied a tiny fraction of corporate pressure. He had completely failed to research exactly how much capital the Lotus Foundation possessed, or the true scope of Apex Holdings. He thought he squeezed a boutique soap maker. He did not realize he was trying to choke a multinational corporation. I switched back to my call with Ben. "Tell the floor supervisors to put the warehouse teams on paid standby." I instructed, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of panic. "Do not cancel a single international order. Keep the lines primed and ready." But Maya, Ben protested, his voice thick with anxiety. "We have no materials. How are we going to manufacture anything?" "Because I am going to buy the raw materials right now," I replied. I disconnected the call, grabbed my tailored coat, and walked out of my office. 30 minutes later, I was standing in the cavernous, gleaming marble lobby of Pacific Global Logistics, an international shipping and raw materials conglomerate that practically controlled the West Coast supply chain. The sheer scale of the building was designed to intimidate with its towering glass atrium and sleek silver security desks, but I felt entirely at home. They were the parent company that owned the shipping routes and the massive agricultural farms supplying those exact oils and waxes. If Chad wanted to use his bank to block my access to the market, I was simply going to buy the market itself. My executive assistant Sarah hurried up to my side, carrying a sleek briefcase filled with our latest financial disclosures and limitless asset portfolios. She looked up at the towering glass ceiling and then back to me, her eyes wide with a mix of awe and apprehension. "Are we really doing this?" Sarah asked, her voice echoing slightly in the vast space. "They are a massive entity, Maya. The corporate buyout alone will be astronomical." I looked down at my phone, staring at the name Chad on my call log. I thought about the sheer arrogance in his voice, his absolute certainty that he could crush my livelihood with a few corrupt phone calls. I smiled, a cold, sharp smile that held absolutely zero mercy. Draft the acquisition papers. The takeover of Pacific Global Logistics was not a negotiation, it was a hostile blitzkrieg. Sarah did not just draft standard acquisition paperwork, she deployed the full predatory financial weight of Apex Holdings. We bypassed their sluggish board of directors entirely and went straight to the majority shareholders, offering a premium buyout in pure liquid cash that no sane corporate investor could possibly refuse. Within 48 hours, the ink was dry and the regulatory filings were sealed. I owned the controlling stake. I owned the massive cargo ships, the international freight lanes, the agricultural contracts, and the entire global infrastructure that Chad's boutique investment bank relied upon to underwrite their massive commercial trade portfolios. He thought he controlled the market because he managed the money. He failed to realize I now owned the physical assets that made his money worth anything at all. While my legal team finalized the brutal corporate restructuring and sent out immediate termination notices to specific vendors, Chad was busy taking a victory lap. He had booked the prime corner booth at Le Petit Chateaubriand, the most exclusive, aggressively overpriced steakhouse in the financial district. He was sitting across from Kiara, slicing into a dry-aged Wagyu ribeye and swirling a glass of vintage Bordeaux. The ambient glow of the crystal chandeliers caught the smug, self-satisfied gleam in his eyes. He was leaning forward, holding Kiara's hand and spinning a tale of his own absolute brilliance. I practically squashed her like a bug. He bragged, his voice carrying arrogantly over the soft jazz playing in the background. You should have heard her warehouse manager panicking on the phone. Maya thought she could waltz into our church, drop a few bank receipts, and walk away the victor. She forgot exactly who she was dealing with. My bank controls the commercial paper for every major supplier on this coast. I snapped my fingers and severed her entire supply chain. She is probably sitting in her empty factory right now, crying over vats of useless soap. Kiara let out a sharp, vindictive laugh, taking a delicate sip of her wine. It is exactly what she deserves, Chad. After the way she humiliated my mother and Marcus in front of the entire congregation, she needed to be put back in her place. She is nothing but a bitter ex-wife playing completely out of her league. You are brilliant, darling. Absolutely brilliant. Chad puffed out his chest, preparing to accept another compliment when his cell phone buzzed violently against the white linen tablecloth. He glanced down, fully expecting a congratulatory text from a junior colleague regarding a recent merger. Instead, the caller ID flashed the name of his firm's senior managing partner. Chad immediately wiped his mouth, sitting up straight and clearing his throat to adopt his most professional, authoritative tone. "Mr. Sterling," he answered, pressing the phone to his ear with a confident, gleaming smile. "Good evening, sir. I am just finishing up a celebratory dinner." The smile vanished from Chad's face faster than a blown-out candle. The color drained completely from his cheeks, leaving him looking physically ill. The voice on the other end of the line was not offering congratulations. It was shouting so loudly and with such absolute fury that Kiara could hear the frantic, tinny echoes from across the table. Chad dropped his silver fork, his hand gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. "What do you mean our shipping contracts are voided?" he yelled, his carefully cultivated composure shattering in the middle of the elegant dining room. "Sir, that is impossible. Pacific Global Logistics handles 70% of our trade underwriting. We have an ironclad 10-year exclusivity agreement with their freight division. If they pull out, our entire commercial portfolio collapses by tomorrow morning. We will be facing billions in default penalties. He listened for another few seconds, his eyes darting frantically around the restaurant as genuine, unadulterated terror seized his chest. He stood up, knocking his heavy mahogany chair back slightly, drawing irritated looks from the neighboring tables. They cannot just dissolve the contracts unilaterally, he argued, his voice cracking with sheer desperation. We have legal protections. Who authorized this sudden restructuring? Who is the new CEO of Pacific Global? Before his boss could answer the question through the receiver, I provided the answer myself. I walked into the softly lit dining room of the steakhouse, moving with absolute silent authority. I wore a tailored crimson blazer that demanded attention, cutting a striking, commanding figure against the subdued velvet background of the restaurant. I bypassed the flustered hostess stand entirely and walked straight toward their prime corner booth, my emerald heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. Kiara saw me first. Her wineglass halted halfway to her mouth, her eyes widening in absolute shock as if she were looking at an apparition. She tugged frantically on Chad's sleeve, but he was too busy panicking into the phone to notice. Chad followed her terrified gaze a second later and slowly lowered his phone from his ear, his jaw slackening as his mind desperately tried to connect the impossible dots forming right in front of his face. I stopped directly at the edge of their table, looking down at the two people who had just been gleefully celebrating my supposed financial ruin. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out the thick embossed business card Chad had smugly handed me at the divorce mediation table just weeks ago. I held his impressive title, his Wall Street prestige, and his entire inflated identity between my fingers. With one swift, deliberate motion, I ripped the heavy cardstock cleanly in half and let the pieces flutter down onto his expensive half-eaten steak. Macroeconomics. Chad, I said, my voice dropping to a lethal quiet register that cut right through his soul. I just squeezed your bank's supply chain. You are fired by Friday. Chad stared at the two halves of his pristine embossed business card, resting in the pool of peppercorn sauce on his plate. The absolute silence in the steakhouse was deafening. Kiara sat completely paralyzed with her wineglass suspended in midair. I did not wait for Chad to formulate a pathetic rebuttal. I simply turned on my emerald heels and walked out of the restaurant, leaving him to explain to his furious boss exactly how he had managed to single-handedly trigger a billion-dollar supply chain collapse. By Thursday morning, the corporate bloodbath was complete. Chad's bank officially terminated his employment, stripping him of his equity, his corner office, and his unearned pride. But desperate men do not simply accept defeat. They scramble. Chad immediately ran to the only person as cornered and ruthless as he was, Victoria. Novatech was drowning. The Securities and Exchange Commission was breathing down Victoria's neck, auditing every single ledger for the embezzled employee pension funds she had used to buy her own engagement ring. Her board of directors was panicking. Chad's career was in ashes. They needed an immediate massive influx of untraceable capital to cover their tracks and save their respective empires from federal indictment. They needed a smokescreen. The solution they engineered was a masterclass in corporate deception. Within 48 hours, embossed silver invitations were hand-delivered to the absolute elite of the city's financial and social circles. Victoria and Chad announced a spectacularly lavish charity gala to be held at the Grand Ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton. On the surface, it was marketed as a philanthropic endeavor to raise funds for underprivileged youth. The society pages aided up praising Victoria for her incredible generosity during a stressful corporate transition. The reality was far more sinister. The charity angle was nothing but a legal shield. The true purpose of the gala was to announce a sudden $50 million merger between Novatech and a shadow subsidiary of Chad's former bank. The merger would flood Victoria's accounts with enough liquid cash to quietly replace the stolen pension funds before the federal auditors could file criminal charges. It would also guarantee Chad a new position as chief financial officer of the newly merged conglomerate. To ensure maximum attendance and media coverage, Evelyn convinced Victoria to double the event as an official high society engagement party for her and Marcus. They were going to use love and charity to mask a multi-million-dollar federal crime. They spared absolutely no expense playing a dangerous game of financial chicken. They booked the entire top floor of the Ritz-Carlton, ordered thousands of imported white orchids, and hired a Michelin-starred culinary team. They were spending money they did not actually have, betting their entire future on the success of the merger announcement. Evelyn and Kiara were entirely oblivious to the federal prison sentences hanging over their families' heads. They only cared about the social triumph. 2 days before the gala, they commandeered the VIP suite of the city's most exclusive bridal and evening wear boutique. They sipped complimentary champagne, while a team of nervous tailors pinned and tucked their custom silk gowns. Evelyn admired her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror, adjusting the glittering diamond necklace Marcus had bought her on credit. "This is exactly where we belong, Kiara." Evelyn sighed, taking a delicate sip from her crystal flute. High society, real power, not scrubbing soap molds in a drafty garage. Kiara laughed, stepping onto the fitting pedestal in a sheer silver dress. Can you imagine Maya's face right now? She probably thought she won because she caused a little scene at church. She has absolutely no idea how macroeconomics work. Chad said she is completely out of her depth, fighting a corporate merger. Evelyn waved her hand dismissively, her heavy rings catching the boutique lighting. "Do not even mention her name today, darling. It ruins the energy." She is probably sitting in her dark, empty house making candles and crying over her bank statements. Let her stay in the mud where she belongs. We have a $50 million empire to celebrate. While Evelyn and Kiara laughed, drinking champagne and celebrating their imaginary victory, I was indeed sitting in my house in the dark. The only light in my sprawling home office came from the glow of 3 massive computer monitors arrayed across my mahogany desk. I was not crying. I was not making candles. I was methodically and clinically dissecting the legal architecture of their entire existence. My lead attorney, Naomi, was on a secure conference call with me, her voice crackling sharply through the desktop speakers. "The merger documents are completely fraudulent," Naomi reported, flipping through a stack of digital files. "Chad is using leveraged debt to create the illusion of capital. But that is not the most interesting part, Maya. I dug into Victoria's family trust, the old money she constantly brags about." I leaned forward, resting my chin on my steepled fingers. "What did you find, Naomi?" "I found a heavily disputed inheritance," Naomi replied, her tone ringing with absolute triumph. Victoria's grandfather did not leave the Novatech seed money to her directly. The estate has been locked in a bitter succession dispute with her estranged uncle for over a decade. Victoria used the pending trust as collateral to secure the ballroom at the Ritz-Carlton. The hotel management accepted the booking based on her family name, assuming the trust was liquid. A cold, predatory smile spread across my face. I looked at the digital property deeds displayed on my center monitor. The Ritz-Carlton was an incredible piece of real estate, but like all massive commercial properties, it was owned by a holding company. A holding company that had recently gone public seeking aggressive private equity investors to expand their luxury portfolio. "Naomi," I said, my voice soft and completely devoid of mercy, "contact the holding company that owns the Ritz-Carlton property. I want to buy the commercial debt on the grand ballroom." "Maya." Naomi laughed, a low, dangerous sound. "You want to buy the debt on the venue they are currently decorating?" "I want to buy the physical space they are standing on," I corrected softly. "Evelyn thinks I am in the dark. Let us see how she handles the spotlight." "Contact the hotel management. As the new primary stakeholder of the property deed, I am executing an immediate hostile takeover of the venue. Let them set up the flowers. Let them ice the champagne. Let them put on their silk dresses." I clicked off the monitor, plunging the room back into absolute darkness. "They want a $50 million engagement party," I whispered to the empty room. "I am going to give them a night they will never forget." The Ritz-Carlton exterior was a fortress of blinding lights and manufactured glamour. A velvet rope lined the grand entrance, holding back a swarm of local press and society photographers. Valets scrambled to park a continuous stream of luxury vehicles, while waitstaff circulated with silver trays of imported champagne. Victoria had spared no expense to project an image of absolute invincibility. She stood at the apex of the red carpet wearing a custom silk gown that cost more than most people's annual salary. Marcus stood proudly beside her, flashing his perfect, polished smile for the cameras, entirely undisturbed by the reality that his freedom hinged on the fraudulent merger they were about to announce. Evelyn and Chad flanked them, completing the portrait of American corporate royalty. Evelyn was draped in borrowed diamonds, practically vibrating with smug satisfaction as she waved to the society reporters. Chad had resurrected his Wall Street arrogance, smoothing the lapels of his bespoke tuxedo, pretending he had not been unceremoniously fired just days prior. They were putting on the performance of a lifetime, completely unaware that the stage they were standing on no longer belonged to them. The rhythmic flashing of cameras suddenly broke rhythm. A low collective murmur rippled through the crowd of photographers as the standard flow of arriving limousines was abruptly halted. A fleet of 6 identical matte black SUVs glided smoothly up the sweeping driveway, bypassing the valet queue entirely. They parked in a synchronized line directly at the base of the red carpet, effectively blocking the entrance and stealing the spotlight from the Golden family posing at the top of the stairs. Victoria frowned, her smile faltering as she peered down the carpet. Chad shifted uncomfortably, his eyes narrowing at the aggressively tinted windows of the lead vehicle. The doors of the SUVs opened in perfect unison. A dozen men in sharp, dark suits stepped out, forming a protective perimeter around the center vehicle. They were not standard hotel security. They were elite private contractors moving with precise military coordination. Naomi stepped out first, holding her sleek leather briefcase, casting a cold, clinical gaze over the red carpet crowd. Then the rear door of the flagship SUV swung wide open, and I stepped out into the blinding glare of the flashbulbs. The silence that fell over the red carpet was absolute and instantaneous. I did not look like the discarded, bitter ex-wife they had spent weeks mocking. I was wearing a breathtaking custom emerald green haute couture gown that hugged my frame, perfectly cascading down into a dramatic sweep of silk. A matching parure of flawless emeralds and brilliant cut diamonds rested against my collarbone, catching the flash of the cameras and refracting the light like shattered glass. I moved with the effortless, terrifying grace of a woman who held total, absolute control. My legal team fanned out behind me, a wall of untouchable corporate power. We began walking up the red carpet. The photographers, too stunned to ask questions, simply held down their shutter buttons, capturing every devastating second of my arrival. At the top of the stairs, the facade of the Golden family was crumbling in real time. Evelyn dropped her champagne flute, letting it shatter against the marble steps. Marcus turned the color of ash, taking a physical step backward as if I were carrying a loaded weapon. Chad stared at the diamond necklace resting on my chest, his financial brain desperately trying to calculate how a small-time soap maker could afford jewels that rivaled the gross domestic product of a small island nation. But Kiara, true to her deeply ingrained arrogance, reacted with pure, unadulterated venom. She saw my arrival not as a display of power, but as a personal insult to her carefully curated social event. Her face twisted into an ugly sneer. She hiked up the skirt of her silver dress and stomped aggressively down the red carpet, pushing past a group of startled reporters. She marched directly toward the velvet rope, where the heavily built head of hotel security stood guarding the main entrance. "Get her out of here!" Kiara shrieked, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. "What are you idiots doing? Do not just stand there letting her walk up the carpet. She is a gatecrasher. She is my brother's pathetic ex-wife, and she has absolutely no business being anywhere near this gala." The head of security, a broad-shouldered man named Harrison, did not move a single muscle. He simply stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching my approach. "Did you not hear me?" Kiara yelled, her voice cracking with hysterical rage. "Remove her immediately. She cannot even afford to breathe the air in this hotel. Call the police if you have to, just get this trash off my red carpet before she ruins the merger announcement." I stopped walking, resting perfectly still at the edge of the velvet rope. My security detail fanned out seamlessly, absorbing the aggressive energy Kiara was projecting. I did not say a word. I simply looked at Harrison. Kiara practically lunged at the velvet rope, her face flushed with fury. I am personal friends with the general manager of this hotel. She threatened, her voice echoing loudly in the sudden quiet of the entrance. If you do not throw this woman onto the street right now, I will have you fired. Harrison slowly turned his head to look at Kiara, his expression completely devoid of emotion. He did not reach for his radio. He did not call for backup. He simply reached out and unhooked the brass clasp of the velvet rope, dropping it heavily against the carpet to clear my path. He then turned his massive frame toward me, planted his feet, and bowed respectfully. "Good evening, Ma'am Harrison," said his deep voice, carrying clearly over the hushed crowd. "The grand ballroom is fully prepared for your inspection." Kiara's jaw dropped open, her manicured hand flying to her mouth as the crushing reality of the situation paralyzed her completely. She stood absolutely frozen. The sheer impossibility of the moment broke her cognitive functioning. Harrison, the massive head of security, was bowing to a woman Kiara had spent years treating like dirt on her shoe. The red carpet, which was supposed to be Kiara's personal runway, had transformed into a tribunal, and she was entirely unequipped for the trial. Evelyn, however, possessed a different kind of arrogance. Where Kiara froze, Evelyn went on the offensive. The matriarch of the family could not process defeat. She refused to accept that the natural order of her high society ecosystem was being disrupted. Her face flushed a deep mottled crimson, contrasting terribly with her borrowed diamonds. She shoved past her paralyzed daughter, her silk gown rustling aggressively against the marble steps. She completely ignored Harrison, realizing the security chief was clearly compromised in her eyes. Instead, she locked her furious gaze on a sharply dressed man hovering near the entrance doors. It was Mr. Vance, the general manager of the Ritz-Carlton. He was a man who catered exclusively to the ultra-wealthy, a man Evelyn considered to be on her personal payroll. "Mr. Vance!" Evelyn barked, her voice shrill and commanding, cutting through the relentless clicking of the press cameras. "I demand you intervene this instant. Your head of security has clearly lost his mind. He is bowing to a gatecrasher, a bitter, unstable woman who has absolutely no business being at my son's engagement gala. I want her removed immediately. If she refuses to leave, call the police and have her arrested for trespassing. And fire Harrison while you are at it." Evelyn stood tall, breathing heavily, waiting for the swift, decisive action she was so accustomed to receiving. She expected Vance to snap his fingers, summon the valets, and drag me out into the street. She expected the world to bend to her will just as it always had, but Vance did not snap his fingers. He did not summon the police. Instead, the general manager stepped forward, his face glistening with a sudden heavy sheen of cold sweat. He pulled a pristine white handkerchief from his breast pocket and dabbed at his forehead, trembling so visibly that his silk tie shook. He did not look at Evelyn. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on the ground near my emerald heels, absolutely terrified to make eye contact with me. Evelyn stared at him, her outrage shifting into pure confusion. "Vance," she snapped, "did you hear my instructions? Remove this woman from my event." Mr. Vance swallowed hard, a nervous gulp that was audible in the heavy silence of the red carpet. He finally raised his head, but he addressed Evelyn with the tone of a man delivering a death sentence. "I apologize, Mrs. Evelyn," he began, his voice shaking, vibrating with absolute dread. "But I cannot remove her." Evelyn's jaw clenched, her eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. "What do you mean you cannot remove her? We rented this entire floor. We paid for an exclusive private event. You work for us tonight." "No," Madam Vance corrected, stepping backward as my legal team moved to flank me. "I work for her." The words hit the air like a physical blow. Victoria, who had been standing silently beside Marcus, suddenly stepped forward, her face draining of all color. "What are you talking about?" Victoria demanded, her voice wavering. "We signed the venue contracts. We secured the ballroom through the Novatech Family Trust." Vance shook his head, refusing to look at Victoria. "The Novatech Family Trust was leveraged as collateral, madam. But the actual commercial deed to this entire property, the ground lease, the building infrastructure, and the operational management rights, were subjected to an aggressive corporate buyout yesterday afternoon. The hotel holding company sold the majority debt. He turned his terrified gaze back to Evelyn, his hands shaking uncontrollably. I cannot throw her out, Mrs. Evelyn, because her venture capital firm Apex Holdings holds the absolute majority ownership of this Ritz-Carlton property. She technically owns the ground you are standing on. The name Apex Holdings hit the group like a detonating bomb. Chad, who had been quietly trying to calculate my net worth based on the emeralds around my neck, physically stumbled. He grabbed the velvet rope to keep from falling, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. He recognized that corporate name immediately. It was the exact same multinational entity that had effortlessly swallowed Pacific Global Logistics 48 hours ago. The same entity that had crushed his supply chain, humiliated his bank, and ended his entire Wall Street career. And now he was standing face to face with its sole proprietor. Victoria was equally devastated. Her knees buckled slightly, and Marcus had to catch her by the elbow to keep her upright. Her mind was racing, spinning out of control. She had orchestrated this entire fraudulent $50 million gala to secure a merger with a shadow investor. She needed that specific investor to save her from federal indictment. And now she realized her venue, her safety, and her entire future were entirely at the mercy of the woman she had spent months trying to destroy. Evelyn looked completely shattered. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The grand illusion of her wealth, the high society status she desperately clung to, had just evaporated into nothing. She was standing in a borrowed dress at a fake charity gala inside a building owned entirely by the daughter-in-law she had discarded. The paralysis gripping the Golden family was absolute. They were trapped in the blinding flash of the press cameras, entirely exposed and completely powerless. They waited for me to speak. They braced themselves for a triumphant, gloating speech, for a dramatic, villainous monologue where I rubbed their spectacular failure in their faces. I gave them absolutely nothing. I did not yell. I did not sneer. I did not even look at them. I treated them with the ultimate, most devastating weapon in my arsenal, complete and total indifference. I stepped forward, my emerald gown sweeping elegantly across the red carpet. My security team parted seamlessly, creating a clear path toward the entrance. I walked right past Kiara, leaving her standing frozen with her mouth hanging open. I glided past Evelyn, whose eyes tracked my every movement with absolute terror. I walked past Chad and Marcus, treating them exactly like what they were, insignificant ghosts, haunting a life I had long since abandoned. I moved gracefully through the massive oak doors and stepped into the grand ballroom. It was a masterpiece of stolen money. Thousands of imported white orchids hung from the vaulted ceilings. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden light over dozens of perfectly arranged dining tables. A string quartet played softly in the corner, completely unaware of the corporate execution happening right outside the doors. I ignored the lavish buffet stations and the towering champagne pyramids. I walked with steady, unbroken purpose toward the absolute center of the room. There, situated on a slightly raised platform, perfectly positioned to command the attention of the entire gala, was the primary VIP table. It was draped in silver silk, decorated with the largest orchid centerpiece in the room. A small embossed gold placard rested perfectly in the center of the table. It was reserved for the mysterious savior of Novatech, the anonymous financial lifeline Victoria and Chad had been desperately praying for. The placard read, "Reserved for lead investor." I pulled back the heavy velvet chair, adjusting the sweep of my silk gown. I sat down at the absolute center VIP table, crossing my legs and resting my diamond-adorned hands elegantly on the silver tablecloth. I looked toward the entrance doors, waiting for my former family to walk inside, and face the architect of their complete destruction. The heavy mahogany doors slowly pushed open. Victoria entered first, her face pale and glistening with a sudden layer of cold sweat. Marcus, Chad, Evelyn, and Kiara trailed closely behind her, walking with the stiff, disjointed movements of prisoners marching directly toward the gallows. The grand illusion of their high society dominance had shattered in the lobby. but the ballroom was still filled with hundreds of elite investors who remained completely oblivious to the hostile takeover. The string quartet was still playing. The champagne was still flowing. Victoria saw me instantly. I was impossible to miss. I was seated at the exact table she had specifically reserved for the anonymous financial savior who was supposed to rescue her from federal indictment. She stared at the placard reading "Lead Investor" and then stared at my diamond necklace. I watched the physical realization hit her like a freight train. Her eyes darted around the extravagant room, taking in the thousands of imported white orchids and the crystal chandeliers she had purchased on credit. She realized in a terrifying flash of clarity that she was standing inside a trap, and the jaws were rapidly snapping shut. Victoria knew her window of survival was closing by the second. Her entire $50 million smokescreen was evaporating right in front of her eyes. If the wealthy investors mingling in this ballroom discovered that she did not even possess the liquid collateral to book the venue, her proposed merger would instantly collapse. The Securities and Exchange Commission would lock her accounts, and the federal auditors would issue warrants for her arrest by morning. She needed the merger funds immediately to cover the stolen pension money. Panic completely overrode her desire to maintain appearances. She began sweating profusely, thick beads of moisture sliding down her temples and ruining her flawless, expensive contour makeup. She practically abandoned Marcus, leaving him standing awkwardly near a towering champagne fountain, and sprinted toward the main stage. Her custom silk gown dragged heavily against the plush carpet, but she did not care. She hoisted herself up the illuminated glass steps, her breath coming in short, frantic gasps as she grasped the crystal podium. She plastered a rigid, desperate smile onto her face, tapping the microphone to command the room's attention. The high society guests paused their conversations, turning their crystal flutes toward the stage, anticipating the grand announcement of the Novatech merger and the celebrated engagement. Victoria opened her mouth, drawing a deep breath to deliver her carefully scripted lie, hoping to secure the financial lifeline before the room realized what was happening. "Welcome, distinguished guests," she projected, leaning into the microphone. But her voice did not echo through the massive ballroom speakers. Instead, the audio system emitted a sharp, high-pitched whine, followed by absolute dead silence. Victoria tapped the microphone again, harder this time, her panic visibly skyrocketing as she realized the equipment was completely unresponsive. "Testing," she whispered urgently, but the sound died inches from her face. She looked frantically toward the sound booth, waving her hands at the technicians and pointing angrily at her microphone. The technicians completely ignored her. They were not taking orders from Novatech anymore. They worked for the venue, and the venue belonged to me. Behind Victoria, the massive digital screens that spanned the entire width of the stage suddenly flickered. The glowing gold Novatech logo, which had been projecting an aura of corporate invincibility, instantly vanished. The crowd let out a collective startled gasp. In its place, a sleek, sharp silver emblem materialized, illuminating the entire ballroom in a cold, calculating light. It was the logo for Apex Holdings. Murmurs rippled aggressively through the crowd. Elite investors in tailored suits exchanged confused and panicked glances, immediately reaching for their cell phones. Chad buried his face in his hands, recognizing the exact corporate logo that had just terminated his Wall Street career and destroyed his bank. Victoria whipped around, staring at the massive screen, her chest heaving as the crushing reality of her failure fully paralyzed her. She gripped the edges of the podium so tightly, her knuckles turned stark white. I stood up from the VIP table. The overhead spotlight instantly shifted away from Victoria and hit the emeralds at my throat, casting a brilliant, commanding glow around my silhouette. The crowd parted automatically, sensing the sheer absolute authority radiating from my presence. I walked calmly toward the stage, ascending the glass steps with deliberate, measured precision. My emerald heels clicked against the glass, echoing in the silent room. Victoria shrank backward, her eyes wide with terror as I approached the podium. "You cannot be up here," she hissed, her voice completely unamplified and weak, masked by the sheer scale of the room. "This is my event. This is my merger. Get off my stage right now." I did not even look at her. I simply signaled the sound technician with a subtle nod. A stagehand hurried out from the wings, bypassing Victoria entirely, and handed me a secondary wireless microphone. A small green light clicked on, indicating the audio feed was live and broadcasting to every single speaker in the grand ballroom. I turned my back on Victoria and faced the sea of elite investors, the wealthy socialites, and the fraudulent family standing frozen near the entrance doors. "Good evening, elite investors," I said, my voice booming clearly and flawlessly across the massive room, echoing with total authority. "I am Maya. Most of you know me as Marcus' ex-wife, but Victoria knows me by a different name." Victoria slammed her hand against the podium, her chest heaving as she stared at me with wild, unblinking eyes. The sheer audacity of my statement seemed to short-circuit her brain. She looked out at the sea of elite investors and high society reporters who were hanging on to my every amplified word, and panic completely consumed her. She frantically grabbed her dead microphone, gripping it so hard her knuckles turned white. "Security!" She screamed, her voice shrill and desperate, echoing thinly without the aid of the sound system. "She is lying. She is a complete fraud. Get her off this stage right now. My lead investor is M.A. Hayes, a reclusive billionaire, not some artisanal soap maker from the suburbs." Her frantic, unamplified voice barely reached the first few rows of tables, but the absolute terror on her face broadcast perfectly to the entire room. The elite investors exchanged highly alarmed glances, immediately recognizing the unmistakable scent of a corporate disaster. I smiled sharply, a cold, calculated expression that mirrored flawlessly across the towering digital screens behind me. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the glacial, terrifying calm of a woman holding the executioner's axe. "M.A. Hayes." I echoed, letting the syllables roll smoothly through the ballroom speakers. M.A. Hayes stands for Maya, a haze. The entire ballroom seemed to stop breathing. Victoria froze, her mouth hanging open as the blood drained entirely from her face. "7 years ago, Victoria, your precious Novatech was hemorrhaging capital." I continued, my voice ringing with lethal precision. "You were weeks away from filing Chapter 11 bankruptcy and losing everything. Your board of directors was preparing to liquidate your assets to pay off your staggering corporate debts. But a mysterious private equity firm swooped in and bought your debt, assuming total financial control. That firm was an early subsidiary of Apex Holdings. I bailed your bankrupt tech startup out of debt 7 years ago. I injected the capital that kept your doors open and your lights on." Victoria stumbled backward, gripping the edge of the glass podium to keep her legs from giving out. She shook her head in silent, horrified denial, but the truth was already tearing her empire apart. "I let you keep the CEO title because a figurehead is useful for maintaining market stability during an acquisition," I explained, dissecting her entire existence in front of her most important peers. "I let you play old money, dress up with your country club friends, and grace the covers of local business magazines while I quietly built my real empire in the background. I allowed you to believe you were a self-made titan of industry, when in reality, you have been working for me for 7 years. I own 86% of your company. I own 86% of your life, Victoria." A collective gasp swept through the glittering crowd. Wall Street executives began urgently pulling out their phones, furiously typing messages to their brokers. The $50 million merger they had come to celebrate was suddenly exposed as a desperate, fraudulent attempt to shift stolen money between two bankrupt entities. Victoria was not a wealthy innovator. She was a heavily indebted employee trying to orchestrate a massive financial crime using my company. I turned my attention away from the trembling, ruined woman at the podium and looked down at the floor. I locked my gaze directly onto Marcus. He was standing near the towering champagne fountain, absolutely paralyzed. His face was the exact color of wet ash. The smug, confident posture he had paraded down the red carpet just minutes ago had completely vanished, replaced by the posture of a man realizing he had just stepped on a landmine. "And Marcus," I purred, my voice dropping to a smooth, devastating register. "You thought you were so incredibly clever. You spent our entire marriage resenting my ambition, complaining about my long hours in the warehouse, and telling your mother I lacked the sophisticated drive to succeed in the real world. You thought my business was just a quaint little hobby meant to keep me busy while you pursued true greatness. Marcus swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically toward Evelyn, who was currently gripping a cocktail table, looking as though she might require immediate medical attention. You thought you were leaving a soap maker for a billionaire CEO. I stated, projecting the absolute truth into every corner of the Ritz-Carlton. You thought you were stepping up into high society, securing a life of effortless luxury and corporate dominance. You actually just left the billionaire to propose to my employee. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and electric. I watched the devastating realization crush the remaining breath out of Marcus' lungs. His entire worldview, his arrogant superiority, and his golden child complex shattered into a million jagged pieces. He had betrayed me, stolen from his church, and humiliated his family, all to climb a social ladder that I secretly owned. He had thrown away a fortune to marry a woman who lived entirely on my payroll. The ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. Reporters shoved past the velvet ropes, flashing their cameras wildly as they documented the greatest corporate humiliation in the history of the city. Investors were shouting into their phones, demanding their financial teams immediately pull any capital tied to Novatech or Chad's disgraced bank. Evelyn let out a strangled, horrified sob, finally understanding that her grand scheme to secure a wealthy daughter-in-law had resulted in total, unmitigated ruin. Kiara covered her face with her hands, trying desperately to hide from the merciless glare of the camera flashes. Marcus stood entirely motionless amidst the swirling, screaming crowd. His eyes were wide, vacant, and completely broken. He stared up at me, standing on the stage in my custom haute couture and flawless diamonds, holding the undisputed power he had always craved. His fingers went entirely numb. Marcus dropped his champagne glass. It hit the marble floor and shattered. The sharp crash of crystal shattering against the marble floor snapped Chad entirely out of his paralyzed stupor. He stared at the broken shards at Marcus' feet, and then his gaze snapped up to me. I watched his eyes widen as his panicked, desperate brain finally connected the catastrophic financial dots. Chad had spent the last 2 weeks desperately trying to hide the fact that his banking firm had unceremoniously fired him. They had fired him because his risk management division had flagged a highly irregular, massively leveraged $50 million commercial loan. The loan Chad had personally authorized. The loan he had pushed through the approval process, using every ounce of his executive influence. That $50 million lifeline had been wired directly into the primary holding accounts of Novatech. But if I owned 86% of Novatech, then I possessed total visibility over all of its financial ledgers. I held access to every single document Victoria had submitted to secure that capital. Chad realized in a horrifying flash of clarity that I had seen the loan applications. He realized that the collateral Victoria had used to guarantee the massive bank loan was entirely fraudulent. She had pledged corporate assets she did not actually own because I owned them. The last shred of Chad's manufactured Wall Street composure instantly evaporated. His face turned a dangerous mottled shade of crimson. The veins in his neck bulged against the stiff collar of his bespoke tuxedo. He let out a raw, guttural scream of absolute fury. He shoved violently past Evelyn, knocking the older woman off balance. He barreled through a cluster of terrified society reporters, shoving expensive camera equipment out of his way. He charged directly toward the illuminated glass steps of the main stage, entirely blinded by his rage. "You set us up!" Chad roared, his voice tearing through the chaotic ballroom. "You planned this from the beginning. You destroyed my career. I will kill you." He lunged for the stairs, his hands curling into violent fists. He did not make it past the first step. Naomi, who had been standing silently near the edge of the stage, simply raised 2 fingers. The response from my elite private security detail was instantaneous and utterly brutal. 2 massive men in dark suits stepped out from the shadows, moving with terrifying synchronized speed. The first guard grabbed Chad by the lapels of his expensive tuxedo, spinning him violently around. The second guard swept a heavy boot behind Chad's knees. Chad went down hard. He hit the floor with a sickening thud, the impact knocking the air completely out of his lungs. Before he could even attempt to struggle, the guards twisted his arms sharply behind his back and forced him aggressively to his knees right at the base of the stage. The surrounding investors scrambled backward, knocking over silver chairs and shattering more champagne flutes in their desperation to get away from the physical altercation. Chad struggled uselessly against the heavy grip of the security contractors, his face pressed uncomfortably close to the sharp edge of the glass stairs. He glared up at me, his chest heaving, his perfectly styled hair falling wildly into his eyes. I did not step backward. I did not flinch. I walked slowly to the very edge of the stage, looking down at him with an expression of absolute glacial pity. I held the wireless microphone loosely in my hand, ensuring my voice carried over the panicked murmurs of the wealthy crowd. "You destroyed your own career, Chad," I stated, my voice cutting through the noise like a steel blade. "Did you really think I would not audit the paperwork for that $50 million loan?" Chad stopped struggling. A cold, paralyzing dread washed over his flushed face. "Did you honestly believe a transaction of that magnitude would simply slip past the Financial Oversight Division of Apex Holdings?" I continued, speaking directly to him, but ensuring every investor in the room absorbed the magnitude of his crime. "You were desperate for the executive commission. Victoria was desperate to hide her insolvency. You completely bypassed your bank's mandatory due diligence protocols because Victoria promised you a massive illicit kickback. You and Victoria forged Novatech's collateral assets." The word "forged" echoed loudly through the grand ballroom. A fresh wave of absolute panic swept through the elite crowd. Wealthy socialites gasped, clutching their diamond necklaces. Prominent hedge fund managers began urgently backing away toward the exits, instantly recognizing that simply being present at this gala could implicate them in a massive federal fraud investigation. "You fabricated revenue streams using ghost subsidiaries," I announced, listing the crimes with methodical, terrifying precision. "You inflated asset valuations by over 400%. You signed federal banking documents pledging commercial properties that legally belong to my venture capital firm. You did not just break corporate policy, Chad. You committed wire fraud, bank fraud, and grand larceny." Chad stared up at me, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The realization that I held documented proof of his federal crimes entirely crushed his fighting spirit. He slumped forward in the grip of the security guards, looking like a hollow, defeated shell of a man. Victoria, realizing that her co-conspirator had just been publicly dismantled, completely lost her mind. She abandoned the podium, hiking up her heavy silk gown and sprinting frantically toward the side exit of the ballroom. She shoved past a startled waiter, knocking a tray of hors d'oeuvres into the air. She was desperately trying to escape before the absolute finality of my trap closed around her. She was too late. The heavy oak doors at the very back of the grand ballroom swung open violently, hitting the marble walls with a thunderous crash. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The room fell into a terrified, breathless silence. A line of stern, unsmiling men and women marched swiftly into the lavish venue. They were not wearing designer evening wear. They were wearing dark tactical gear and heavy windbreakers with the letters FBI printed across their backs in bold, aggressive yellow. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a shaved head and a completely unyielding expression, did not pause to admire the crystal chandeliers or the thousands of imported white orchids. He marched straight down the center aisle of the grand ballroom, his tactical boots sinking heavily into the plush custom carpet. His team moved in a synchronized wedge formation, slicing effortlessly through the panicked sea of elite investors and terrified socialites. The wealthy guests scrambled backward, overturning silver chairs and spilling expensive champagne on their designer shoes, entirely desperate to avoid obstructing federal law enforcement. They reached the base of the stage where my private security contractors were still holding Chad firmly against the illuminated glass steps. I gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. My men instantly released their grip and stepped back, melting seamlessly into the shadows of the ballroom, leaving Chad kneeling alone on the floor. Chad tried to scramble to his feet, his chest heaving with exertion, but two FBI agents immediately grabbed him by the arms, hauling him up only to slam him face first against the side of the stage. Chad whimpered, his bespoke tuxedo jacket tearing at the shoulder seam as he hit the glass. "Chadwick Porter." The lead agent announced his voice carrying a cold bureaucratic authority that echoed loudly through the massive silent room. You are under arrest for federal wire fraud conspiracy to commit bank fraud and severe violations of the Securities Exchange Act. Chad squeezed his eyes shut. His face pressed awkwardly against the stage as the heavy steel handcuffs clicked harshly around his wrists. He did not fight back. The absolute crushing reality that his lucrative Wall Street career was completely permanently dead had finally paralyzed him. Victoria, who had been frozen near the side exit, suddenly snapped back to reality. She spun around, hiking up her custom silk gown, and made a desperate manic sprint toward the service kitchen doors, hoping to disappear into the hotel corridors. She did not even make it 5 feet. A female agent intercepted her, grabbing Victoria by the shoulder and spinning her violently around. Victoria shrieked, stumbling backward in her towering stiletto heels until she hit a catering table, sending a silver tray of beluga caviar crashing to the marble floor. Victoria Thorne, the lead agent, called out, abandoning Chad to his subordinates and marching directly toward the disgraced CEO. You are under arrest for grand larceny, corporate embezzlement, and extensive violations of federal pension laws. Victoria gasped, her chest heaving rapidly as she shook her head in frantic manic denial. No! She screamed, her voice shrill and entirely unhinged, cutting through the heavy silence of the ballroom. This is a massive mistake. I am the CEO of Novatech. I am merging with Apex Holdings. You cannot touch me. I have friends in the federal government. The lead agent did not even blink. Novatech is a fraudulent shell company. He stated, his voice loud enough for every single society reporter in the room to record. You are being charged with embezzling over $12 million from your own employees' retirement pension funds. You used that stolen federal money to falsify collateral to fund this fraudulent $50 million gala and to purchase the $4 million diamond engagement ring currently sitting on your left hand. A collective wave of absolute disgust rippled through the ballroom. The elite investors who had just moments ago viewed Victoria as a brilliant peer now looked at her with pure, unadulterated revulsion. Stealing pension money was the ultimate corporate sin. She had robbed her own working-class employees to pay for imported champagne and borrowed diamonds. The society reporters who had been invited to document a historic corporate triumph immediately realized they were witnessing the high society crime bust of the decade. They swarmed the perimeter of the velvet ropes, holding down their shutter buttons. The rapid, blinding flashes of the cameras illuminated Victoria's tear-streaked, ruined face, capturing her total destruction from every possible angle. The female agent forcibly pulled Victoria's arms behind her back. Victoria thrashed wildly, her expensive silk gown ripping along the corset line, but the agent easily overpowered her. The sharp, metallic, ratcheting sound of the handcuffs locking around Victoria's wrists echoed through the ballroom like a final, devastating gavel strike. The agents flanked Victoria and Chad, forcing them to turn around and march back down the center aisle. The red carpet that Victoria had commissioned to serve as her glorious runway to elite dominance had instantly transformed into her personal, agonizing walk of shame. Evelyn stood near the back of the room, clutching her chest, letting out a long, horrified wail before collapsing against a velvet pillar, entirely unable to process the total public destruction of her family name. Kiara was actively hiding behind a massive floral arrangement, terrified that the agents might somehow arrest her simply by association. As the agents dragged Victoria past the towering champagne fountain, she desperately dug her heels into the carpet, fighting the physical momentum. She threw her head back, searching the glittering crowd with wild, frantic eyes, until she locked onto the man she had orchestrated this entire fraudulent spectacle to impress, Marcus. Victoria screamed, her voice tearing with absolute raw panic. Marcus, do something. Call your corporate lawyers. Call your fathers. Federal fixers. Do not just stand there. You are my fiancé. You have to help me. Marcus stood perfectly still. He looked at Victoria thrashing in federal custody. He looked at the heavily armed FBI agents gripping her arms. He looked at the reporters eagerly documenting her humiliating downfall. And then he looked up at the stage, meeting my cold, indifferent gaze. The golden boy of elite society, the man who had always relied on his family name to shield him from consequences, finally realized the bitter truth. Standing next to Victoria was a guaranteed prison sentence. Defending her meant throwing away his own inherited wealth and joining her in a federal cell. Marcus did not love Victoria. He only loved the power she pretended to hold. Marcus slowly, deliberately took a large physical step backward. He did not reach for his phone. He did not call his lawyers. He raised both of his hands in the air in a gesture of total, absolute surrender, completely abandoning the woman he had just proposed to, leaving her to rot in federal prison just to save his own skin. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind the FBI agent, sealing Victoria and Chad outside in the corridor and leaving a suffocating vacuum of silence in the grand ballroom. Marcus stood perfectly still with his hands raised in the air until the flashing lights of the press cameras finally faded into the lobby. Slowly, he lowered his arms, his eyes darting frantically around the room. The elite investors, the prominent hedge fund managers, and the high society reporters were all looking at him with absolute, unadulterated contempt. He was no longer the golden boy of Boston society. He was the fool who had abandoned a billionaire to marry a federally indicted fraudster. Evelyn and Kiara were huddled near the broken champagne fountain, shivering, as if the temperature in the room had plummeted, freezing their blood. Evelyn looked down at her borrowed diamond necklace, suddenly realizing that without Victoria or Chad, there was no $50 million merger. There was no safety net to catch them. The bank would seize their grand estate by the end of the month. The credit cards would be frozen by morning. They were utterly, entirely destitute. Marcus looked at me. His gaze dropped from my emerald necklace down to the hem of my custom silk gown. I watched the mechanical gears of his opportunistic brain grinding together as a new horrifying realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. When we finalized our divorce, he had been so incredibly eager to protect his family trust fund that he had aggressively forced me to sign a watertight, ironclad prenuptial agreement. He had demanded that we waive all rights to each other's future earnings. He thought he was protecting his ancestral wealth from a struggling soap maker. Instead, he had legally, permanently locked himself out of a multi-billion-dollar venture capital empire. He had handed me the pen and eagerly watched me sign away his right to a fortune. His breathing turned shallow and ragged. The remaining society reporters, realizing the drama was not quite over, turned their lenses toward him. Marcus did not care about the cameras anymore. He cared only about survival. He took a stumbling, hesitant step toward the stage, then another. He crossed the short distance between the velvet rope and the glass stairs, his expensive leather shoes crunching loudly over the shards of his shattered champagne flute. When he reached the base of the podium, his legs gave out completely. Marcus dropped heavily to his knees, hitting the marble floor with a loud, dull thud that echoed across the silent ballroom. He stared up at me, his handsome face twisted into an ugly mask of sheer desperation. "Maya, baby, please!" Marcus begged, his voice cracking as hot, pathetic tears spilled over his eyelashes. "I was manipulated. Victoria lied to me. Chad lied to me. They fed me a story about corporate synergy and family duty, and I was too blind to see the truth. You have to believe me. We are family, Maya. You know I always loved you. I never wanted the divorce. My mother pushed me into it." Evelyn, hearing her son throw her directly under the bus to save himself, let out a strangled gasp. But her own desperation instantly overrode her maternal outrage. She practically threw herself across the ballroom, scrambling toward the stage alongside him. She fell to her knees right next to Marcus, the proud matriarch of the family, reduced to a groveling spectacle in front of the city's financial elite. Evelyn reached out with trembling manicured hands and grabbed a fistful of my emerald silk gown, wrinkling the delicate fabric. "Forgive him, Maya," she sobbed, her carefully styled hair falling wildly around her tear-streaked face. "The Lord says to forgive. We made mistakes, but we can fix this. You can come back home. We can be a family again. Please, Maya, show some grace." I looked down at the two of them kneeling in the spilled champagne and broken glass. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel anger. I felt nothing but an absolute clinical disgust. I yanked my gown violently backward, tearing the silk right out of Evelyn's desperate grasp. She stumbled forward, catching herself awkwardly against the hard edge of the glass steps. The Lord also says, you reap what you sow. Evelyn, I stated, my voice carrying through the microphone, slicing through her pathetic sobbing with surgical precision. You do not get to invoke grace after spending 5 years treating me like a disease you caught by accident. I turned my cold gaze back to Marcus, who was looking up at me with wide, pleading eyes, like a stray dog begging for a scrap of meat. You were not manipulated, Marcus. I told him, projecting every word across the silent ballroom. You were just greedy. You sat at your grand mahogany dining table every single Sunday and called me a disappointment. You looked at my hands cracked and blistered from working 14-hour shifts to build my company, and you mocked me. You laughed at the artisanal soap I made with my bare hands, calling it a pitiful little hobby, while you lived off an allowance from your father's trust fund. Marcus flinched, closing his eyes against the brutal public exposure of his profound arrogance. You wanted a woman with a corporate pedigree. I continued, my voice dropping into a lethal, terrifying register. You threw me away for a woman wearing a borrowed suit playing with stolen pension funds. So now you get to live with the exact life you actively, violently chose. Maya, please, Marcus whispered, shaking his head frantically. I have nothing left. The banks are going to take everything. I do not even have enough liquidity to pay my own legal retainers. I am begging you, just a small loan, just enough to keep us off the street. I stared at him for a long, heavy moment, letting him steep in the absolute humiliation of begging his discarded wife for survival money in front of the entire financial district. I unclasped my emerald-encrusted clutch. I reached inside and pulled out a sleek black leather checkbook. The crowd collectively held its breath, the only sound in the room the soft rustle of paper as I pulled a gold-plated pen from my bag. I uncapped the pen. I flattened the checkbook against the glass podium. I wrote out a specific, highly calculated amount, signing my name with a sharp, decisive flourish. I tore the check slowly from the binding, the ripping sound amplified through the microphone. I stepped right to the edge of the stage, looking down at Marcus. I held the check out over the empty air between us and simply let go. The crisp slip of paper fluttered downward, caught in the slight draft of the ballroom air conditioning. It drifted slowly side to side until it landed softly directly across Marcus' upturned face. Marcus reached up with trembling, sweat-slicked fingers and pulled the small rectangular slip of paper off his cheek. He stared blindly at the dark blue ink for a long, frantic moment. He squinted, his eyes darting across the handwritten numbers, expecting to see a string of zeros that would save him. He was waiting for the $1,000,000 lifeline. He was waiting for the golden parachute that his family name had always guaranteed him. He blinked rapidly, his chest heaving with desperate, shallow breaths, as the actual ink finally came into focus. The check was written out for exactly $15.00. A strangled, pathetic noise escaped the back of his throat. He looked up at me, his perfectly handsome face crumpling into a mask of absolute, terrified confusion. He held the crisp paper between his shaking thumbs as if it were physically burning his skin. $15, he choked out, his voice cracking under the crushing weight of his sudden poverty. That is the price of 1 bar of my handmade soap. I stated, my voice carrying through the amplification system and echoing across the dead, silent ballroom. The words struck him with the brutal force of a physical blow. He flinched, physically recoiling as the sheer, calculated insult washed over him. The same soap you told your country club friends was a pathetic distraction, I continued, staring down at him with glacial indifference. The same soap you laughed at while living completely off an allowance generated by my secret labor. So you can take that $15, Marcus. Use it to catch a city bus back to your mother's house. You will need to learn the public transit routes tonight, because your vintage imported sports car was legally repossessed by my banking division exactly 1 hour ago. My security team took the keys directly from the valet stand outside. Marcus dropped his head into his hands, letting out a loud, agonizing wail that echoed horribly across the marble floor. Beside him, Evelyn let out a secondary, piercing shriek. She collapsed completely against the base of the glass stairs, her expensive designer gown soaking up the spilled champagne, and the dirty water pooling from the broken fountain. She clawed at the carpet, her heavy pearl necklace dragging against the floor, as the absolute reality of her destitution finally broke her mind. Kiara stood frozen in the background, her jaw hanging open, and mascara running in thick dark tracks down her pale cheeks. She was entirely paralyzed by the sudden violent reality of being poor. I looked at the three of them groveling in the wreckage of their own making. They had spent years mocking my heritage, belittling my skin color, and treating my relentless ambition like a dirty lower-class trait. They had weaponized their generational wealth and their blinding arrogance to make me feel small. Now they were weeping on the ballroom floor, openly begging for scraps from the very woman they had tried to systematically destroy. I did not offer them another word. They were no longer worth my breath. I turned my back on the weeping, broken family. The heavy emerald silk of my custom gown swept elegantly across the stage floor as I walked away from the podium. I descended the glass steps, my heels clicking against the glass with sharp, rhythmic precision. The remaining Wall Street elites, the ruthless hedge fund managers, and the high society reporters instantly stepped back. They parted like the Red Sea, scrambling over themselves to get out of my way. Men who ran multi-billion-dollar global portfolios lowered their eyes to the floor as I passed. Wealthy women covered in diamonds held their breath, pressing themselves against the velvet ropes. They watched me walk down the center aisle with absolute awe and sheer unadulterated terror. They now knew exactly who Maya Hayes was. I was not a quiet, submissive suburban wife. I was the undisputed apex predator of their entire financial ecosystem, and I had just publicly slaughtered an entire corporate dynasty without breaking a sweat. I walked straight down the center aisle, keeping my posture perfectly straight, and my gaze locked straight ahead. The rapid flashing of the camera lenses captured every single step of my exit, but not a single reporter dared to step into my path or shout a question. The silence of the crowd was a heavy, suffocating blanket of profound respect. I pushed through the heavy oak doors at the back of the room, leaving the stifling, humid air of the ruined corporate gala behind me. I walked through the gilded corridors of the Ritz-Carlton lobby. The soft classical piano music piped through the ceiling speakers provided a stark, surreal contrast to the utter devastation I had just orchestrated inside the ballroom. The hotel staff stood at attention, recognizing the shift in power radiating from my every step. The valet staff rushed forward, pushing open the heavy glass entrance doors for me. I stepped out into the cool, crisp night air. The chill of the city breeze felt incredibly refreshing against my heated skin, washing away the last lingering traces of my old life. In the distance, echoing through the downtown canyons, I could hear the faint wail of police sirens carrying Victoria and Chad away to their new federal realities. A sleek custom black Rolls-Royce glides silently up the circular driveway, its polished exterior reflecting the warm golden glow of the hotel street lamps. The driver, wearing a sharp tailored suit, stepped out immediately and opened the rear passenger door for me, bowing his head in quiet, deep respect. I stepped inside the expansive, luxurious cabin, settling comfortably into the plush leather seat. I pulled the heavy door shut, sealing myself away from the noise, the flashing lights, and the remnants of my past. I had left the smoldering ashes of their lies, their vicious racism, and their blinding arrogance behind me forever. They were nothing but a footnote in the history of my empire. I reached forward and picked up a crystal flute of perfectly chilled vintage champagne, waiting for me in the center console holder. I leaned back against the soft leather, closing my eyes for a brief, victorious second. I took a slow, deep sip of the champagne, letting the crisp, bright taste wash over my tongue as the car accelerated smoothly into the night. The glittering city lights blurred into streaks of gold and silver passing by my tinted window. I had finally claimed everything that belonged to me. The screen fades to black. The ultimate lesson from Maya's triumph is that arrogance and superficial judgments are the architects of one's own destruction. Marcus and his family mistook quiet resilience for weakness, mocking the foundation of the wealth they desperately craved. By prioritizing status over genuine character, they lost everything to the woman they deemed beneath them. Maya's calculated revenge proves that true power doesn't need to shout. It simply waits for greed to expose itself. Never underestimate those quietly building their empires in the shadows. Drop your own story of reclaiming your power in the comments below and subscribe for more.